Hello everyone. I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. Cradle of Blood. Chapter 1. The perfect family. Maplewood was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was a postcard-perfect slice of Americana. White picket fences lined the streets, children rode their bikes to the park, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries over freshly mowed lawns. The air always smelled of honeysuckle and pine, and the rhythm of life was steady, predictable, and safe. At the center of it all stood the Harrington house, a sprawling Victorian home with pristine white siding, a wraparound porch, and a garden so immaculate it looked like it belonged in a magazine. But for all its charm, there was something unsettling about the house, as if it watched and waited, its windows staring out like unblinking eyes. Eleanor and Victor Harrington were the envy of the neighborhood. Eleanor, with her always flawless blonde bob and pearl necklace, was the epitome of grace. She baked pies for church fundraisers, volunteered at the library, and always had a kind word for everyone she met. Victor, tall and broad-shouldered with a warm smile, was the kind of man who could charm anyone. He coached Little League, fixed leaky faucets for elderly neighbors, and seemed to radiate an effortless, all-American charisma. Together, they were the picture of marital bliss. Their children, 12-year-old Lily and 10-year-old Henry, were polite and well-behaved, always saying please and thank you without prompting. On the surface, the Harringtons were perfect. But behind the Harringtons' perfect facade, something was deeply wrong. It started with the silence. Visitors to the house would comment on how unnervingly quiet it was, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The air was thick with something unspoken, a tension that no one could quite put their finger on. Even the family dog, a golden retriever named Max, seemed to tread lightly around his owners, his tail perpetually tucked between his legs. He would whimper softly when Victor entered the room, and Eleanor would shush him with a sharp look that sent him scurrying under the table. Lily and Henry were quiet, too quiet. Their eyes, once bright and curious, now held a hollow emptiness. They rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, their words were measured and careful, as if they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. At school, they kept to themselves, never joining in on games or laughter. The teachers chalked it up to shyness, but the other children whispered about how strange they were. They would sit alone at lunch, their sandwiches untouched, staring out the window with distant, haunted expressions. The Harringtons' housewarming party was supposed to be the event of the season. Eleanor had spent weeks planning it, baking pies, and arranging bouquets of fresh flowers from her garden. The neighbors arrived in droves, eager to get a glimpse inside the Harringtons' beautiful home. As the guests mingled in the sunlit dining room, sipping on lemonade and marveling at the antique furniture, Lily and Henry stood stiffly in the corner, their hands clasped tightly in front of them. Eleanor smiled warmly at them, but there was a sharpness in her gaze that made them flinch. "Lily, darling, why don't you help me pass out the napkins?" she said, her voice sweet but laced with an edge that only her children could hear. As Lily moved mechanically through the room, a neighbor caught her arm. "You're such a good girl," the woman cooed, but Lily recoiled as if burned. Her eyes darted to her mother, who was watching her like a hawk. "Thank you," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman frowned, unsettled by the girl's reaction, but Eleanor quickly intervened. "She's just shy," she said with a laugh, though her eyes never left Lily. "Isn't that right, sweetheart?" Lily nodded, her face pale, and hurried back to her brother's side. The party dragged on, the laughter and chatter filling the house, but the children remained on the outskirts, their presence almost ghostly. Henry clung to his sister's hand, his eyes darting nervously around the room. When a ball rolled into the hallway, and one of the younger guests ran after it, Henry let out a small, strangled cry. "Don't," he said, but it was too late. The child disappeared down the hallway, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor's smile froze, and Victor's hand tightened around his glass. The child returned moments later, oblivious, but the tension in the air lingered. As the sun began to set and the guests started to leave, a sense of relief seemed to wash over the Harrington children. They stood by the door, saying goodbye to the neighbors with stiff smiles. When the last guest was gone, Eleanor shut the door with a soft click and turned to her family. Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Lily, Henry, clean up the kitchen," she said, her voice sharp. "And don't forget the rules." The children nodded, their faces pale, and hurried to obey. Upstairs, the house was silent except for the faint creak of floorboards. In the basement, a door stood slightly ajar, its darkness seeming to pulse faintly. Victor disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps echoing softly. Eleanor lingered in the hallway, her eyes fixed on the basement door. "It's almost time," she murmured to herself, a faint smile playing on her lips. Almost time for the next one. Outside, the moon cast an eerie glow over the Harrington house. The garden, so beautiful in the daylight, now looked sinister, the flowers bending as if in prayer. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, and the wind whispered through the trees like a warning. The perfect family was anything but, and their secrets were buried deep. But secrets have a way of rising to the surface, no matter how hard you try to keep them buried. And in Maplewood, the truth was about to come out in Blood, Chapter 2. The basement secret. The basement was the one place in the Harrington house that no one dared to enter. It was always locked, the heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bolts that seemed out of place in a home so otherwise charming. The children had been warned never to go down there, not even to fetch something for their parents. "It's dangerous," Eleanor would say, her voice cold and final. "You wouldn't want to get hurt, would you?" The way she said it made it clear that the danger wasn't from falling or tripping, it was from her. But curiosity has a way of gnawing at the mind, especially when you're a child. Lily had been thinking about the basement more and more lately. It wasn't just the locked door or the strange noises she sometimes heard late at night, a faint scratching, like nails against wood. It was the way her parents acted whenever the basement was mentioned. Their eyes would darken, their voices would drop, and the air would grow heavy with something she couldn't quite name. Fear? Excitement? Both. One night, after her parents had gone to bed, Lily crept downstairs. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made her feel like she was being watched. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the basement door. The lock glinted in the moonlight, taunting her. She knew she shouldn't do this, but she had to know. What were her parents hiding? What was so important that they would lock it away? She hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. She thought about the way her parents looked at her sometimes, like she was a disappointment, like she didn't belong. She thought about the rules, so many rules, and the punishments for breaking them. But she also thought about the way her brother looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to be strong. She couldn't let him down. Not again. With trembling fingers, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the keys she had stolen from her mother's dresser earlier that day. It was cold and heavy in her hand, and for a moment she considered putting it back. But then she heard it again, that faint scratching, like something was trying to get out. She took a deep breath and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying with it a smell that made her stomach churn. It was the smell of rot, of something long dead and forgotten. She hesitated again, her fear threatening to overwhelm her. But then she thought about Henry, about the way he flinched whenever their parents raised their voices. She had to be brave for him. She stepped inside, the wooden stairs groaning under her weight. The basement was pitch black, but she had brought a flashlight. She turned it on, and the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a room that looked more like a dungeon than a basement. The walls were made of rough stone, stained with something dark and dried. Chains hung from the ceiling, their ends clinking softly in the breeze from the open door. In the center of the room was a table, its surface covered in strange tools, knives, saws, and things she couldn't even name. And then she saw the blood. It was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, even on the ceiling. Her stomach lurched, and she had to fight the urge to vomit. What had happened here? What had her parents done? Before she could think about it too much, she heard a sound, a soft, muffled whimper. It was coming from the far corner of the room. She turned the flashlight in that direction, and her heart stopped. There, huddled in the shadows, was a figure. It was a girl, no older than Lily herself. Her clothes were torn and stained with blood, and her face was pale and gaunt. She looked up at Lily with wide, terrified eyes, and Lily realized with a sinking feeling that she wasn't the first. The girl opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Lily took a step forward, her mind racing. She had to help her. She had to get her out. But before she could do anything, she heard a voice behind her, a voice that made her blood run cold. "What do you think you're doing, Lily?" She turned around, the flashlight slipping from her hand. Standing in the doorway was her mother, her face twisted into a mask of fury. In her hand was a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had seen too much, and now she would have to pay the price. Chapter 3. Dinner with the Harringtons. Dinner at the Harrington house was always a meticulously orchestrated affair. The table was set with fine china, the silverware polished to a mirror shine, and the aroma of roasted meat and freshly baked bread filled the dining room. Eleanor presided over the meal with a calm, almost eerie perfection, her every movement deliberate and controlled. Victor sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding yet unsettling, his eyes darting between his wife and children with an intensity that made Lily shrink into her seat. Tonight's dinner was no different, except that Lily's hands trembled as she clutched her fork, her mind still reeling from what she had seen in the basement. She couldn't look at her mother without seeing the knife, couldn't look at her father without imagining what he might have done in that blood-stained room. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Across from her, Henry sat in silence, his small frame tense, as if he were waiting for something terrible to happen. "Pass the salt, Lily," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and calm. Lily flinched, nearly dropping the salt shaker as she handed it to her mother. Eleanor's fingers brushed hers, and the contact sent a shiver down her spine. "Why are you so jumpy tonight, dear? Is something wrong?" There was an edge to her voice, a thinly veiled threat that made Lily's stomach churn. "And no, nothing," Lily stammered, forcing herself to meet her mother's gaze. Eleanor's eyes were dark and unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in them, anger, maybe, or suspicion. Lily quickly looked away, her heart racing. She knew her mother couldn't know about the basement, not yet, but the way she was looking at her made her feel like she was already caught. Victor cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Eleanor, the roast is excellent tonight. As always." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor inclined her head in acknowledgement, her expression softening only slightly. "Thank you, Victor. I'm glad you're enjoying it." Her gaze shifted back to Lily, and the warmth in her voice vanished. "Lily, aren't you going to eat? You've barely touched your food." Lily forced herself to take a bite, the meat dry and tasteless in her mouth. She chewed slowly, her stomach turning with every swallow. Across the table, Henry mirrored her movements, his small hands shaking as he lifted his fork. He kept his eyes down, his face pale and drawn. Lily wondered if he had heard the scratching too, if he had ever thought about opening the basement door. The meal continued in near silence, the only sound the clinking of silverware against plates. The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Lily could feel her parents' eyes on her, watching her every move, and it took all her willpower not to bolt from the table. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she knew better than to challenge her parents. Not here. Not now. When the meal was finally over, Eleanor stood and began clearing the table. Lily and Henry jumped up to help, their movements quick and practiced. "Be careful with the plates, Lily," Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "We wouldn't want another accident, would we?" Lily nodded mutely, her hands clenched around the stack of dishes. She knew what her mother was referring to, the time she had dropped a plate and been punished for it. The memory of that night still haunted her, the bruises on her arms fading but never quite gone. As they worked, Lily caught Henry's eye and gave him a small, reassuring smile. He returned it hesitantly, his fear obvious. They were in this together, she reminded herself. Whatever their parents were hiding, whatever horrors lay in the basement, they would face them together. But the thought did little to ease the knot of dread in her stomach. Once the kitchen was clean, Eleanor turned to her children with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Now, it's time for bed. Tomorrow is a busy day." Her tone left no room for argument, and Lily and Henry nodded obediently. As they climbed the stairs, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder and saw her mother standing at the bottom of the staircase, her expression inscrutable. Victor stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his eyes dark and calculating. In their shared bedroom, Lily and Henry huddled together, their voices barely above a whisper. "Did you hear it too?" Lily asked, her heart pounding. "The scratching." Henry nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "I think there's someone down there," he whispered. "Someone like us." Lily's stomach churned at the thought, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We have to be careful," she said. "We can't let them know we're suspicious." As they lay in bed, the house fell silent once more. But the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards and the distant sound of footsteps. Lily stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She didn't know what was going to happen, but one thing was clear: the Harrington family was anything but perfect, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 4. The first ritual. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie silver light over the Harrington house. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. Lily lay in bed, her body stiff beneath the covers, her ears straining for any sign of what was to come. She had known something was off for weeks, ever since she discovered the basement, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she could feel it in her bones. Something was about to happen. Downstairs, the faint murmur of voices drifted up the staircase. Lily's heart raced as she recognized the low rumble of her father's voice, calm and commanding, and the softer, colder tones of her mother. She glanced over at Henry, who was lying in the bed across from hers, his wide eyes glinting in the moonlight. He was awake too, his small frame tense beneath the blankets. "Lily," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and then she heard the unmistakable sound of the basement door creaking open. Her heart leapt into her throat. "Stay here," she whispered, slipping out of bed and tiptoeing toward the door. Henry shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with fear, but she ignored him. The hallway was dimly lit, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. Lily pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she crept toward the top of the stairs. The voices were clearer now, their words sending a chill down her spine. "Is everything prepared?" her father asked, his voice low and steady. "Yes," her mother replied, her tone businesslike. "But we must hurry. The moon won't wait." Lily's heart pounded as she peered down the staircase. Her parents stood in the foyer, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. In her father's hand was a long, curved knife, its blade catching the light in a way that made her stomach twist. Her mother held a large, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "Are you sure about this?" Victor asked, his voice tense. "We have no choice," Eleanor replied, her eyes hard. "It's the only way." Without another word, They turned and disappeared into the basement. The door shut behind them with a soft click, leaving the hallway in silence. Lily's mind raced. What were they doing? What was in that book? She had to find out. Taking a deep breath, she crept down the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears. The basement door loomed before her, ominous and foreboding. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, and then turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and the faint sound of chanting drifted up from below. Lily's stomach churned, but she forced herself to take a step forward. She had to know. She had to see. The staircase groaned beneath her weight as she descended, the chanting growing louder with each step. The air grew colder, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Finally, she reached the bottom and peeked around the corner. What she saw made her blood run cold. The basement had been transformed. The walls were covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like blood, their lines jagged and uneven. In the center of the room stood her parents, their backs to her, their figures silhouetted by the light of a dozen candles. The knife gleamed in her father's hand, and the book lay open on a makeshift altar in front of them. But that wasn't what made Lily's heart stop. On the floor, lying still and silent, was a girl. She was young, no older than Lily herself, her pale skin almost translucent in the flickering candlelight. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. And surrounding her was a circle of salt, unbroken and perfect. "We begin," Eleanor intoned, her voice cold and emotionless. Victor raised the knife, his face a mask of grim determination. Lily clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream, her mind screaming at her to do something, anything. But she was frozen in place, her body refusing to obey. The chanting grew louder, a discordant melody that made her head pound. The air seemed to vibrate, the candles flickering wildly as the temperature dropped. And then, with a suddenness that took her breath away, the room fell silent. Victor plunged the knife downward. Chapter 5. The stranger's warning. The morning after the ritual was unervingly calm. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the Harrington house, casting a golden glow over the immaculate kitchen where Eleanor hummed softly as she prepared breakfast. The smell of bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and for a moment it seemed like any other day in Maplewood. But Lily sat at the table, her hands trembling around her glass of orange juice, her mind still replaying the horrors she had witnessed the night before. She hadn't slept a wink. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the girl lying on the basement floor, the knife glinting in her father's hand, the way the candles had flickered and died as the ritual reached its climax. She had crept back to her room in a daze, her body numb with shock, and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if any of it had been real. But the distant memory of her mother's cold voice and the metallic tang of blood in the air told her it was no nightmare. Across the table, Henry picked at his food, his face pale and drawn. He kept glancing at Lily, his eyes filled with unspoken questions, but she couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. She didn't know how to tell him what she had seen, didn't know how to protect him from the truth. Her hands clenched into fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to steady her breathing. "Lily, darling, are you feeling okay?" Eleanor's voice broke through her thoughts, smooth and sweet, but there was an edge to it that made Lily's skin crawl. She forced herself to nod, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine, Mom." Eleanor studied her for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, before she smiled and turned back to the stove. "Good. You've been so quiet lately. I hope you're not coming down with something." Victor entered the kitchen then, his presence filling the room as he took his seat at the head of the table. He glanced at his children, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention to the newspaper in his hands. Lily couldn't help but notice the faint red stain on his cuff, barely visible against the white fabric of his shirt. Her stomach churned, and she looked away, her appetite gone. As the family ate in silence, a knock at the front door shattered the fragile calm. Eleanor's head snapped up, her smile faltering for the first time. "Who could that be?" she muttered, setting down her spatula and wiping her hands on her apron. Victor folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the hallway. "I'll get it," he said, his voice low and tense. Lily exchanged a quick glance with Henry, her heart racing as she heard the front door open. A man's voice floated in from the foyer, unfamiliar and commanding. "Mr. Harrington, I'm Detective Grayson. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Her father's reply was calm, but Lily could hear the undercurrent of tension in his voice. "Of course, Detective. Please come in." Eleanor's face tightened, her hands clenching the edge of the counter as she listened to the conversation. Lily could feel the air in the kitchen grow heavier, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Children," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice sharp, "finish your breakfast and go to your rooms. Now." Lily and Henry didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their plates and slipped out of the kitchen, their footsteps quick and quiet as they made their way upstairs. Once they were in their shared bedroom, Lily pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear the conversation downstairs. The detective's voice was muffled, but she could make out a few words. "Missing girl, last seen near your property. Suspicious activity." Her father's responses were calm and measured, but she could hear the strain in his voice. "We're just a normal family, Detective. You're welcome to look around, but I assure you, you won't find anything." Lily's heart pounded as she heard footsteps moving through the house, the detective's voice growing louder as he approached the basement door. She held her breath, her fingers digging into the wood of the door, as she waited for the inevitable. But then her father's voice cut in, firm and unyielding. "I'm afraid the basement is off-limits, Detective. It's unstable, and I wouldn't want you to get hurt." There was a pause, and then the detective's voice, sharp and probing. "Unstable, you say?" Her father's reply was smooth and practiced. "Yes, the foundation's been giving us trouble. We're having it looked at next week." The conversation shifted then, the detective's tone softening as he thanked her father for his time. Lily heard the front door close, and the house fell silent once more. She turned to Henry, her face pale and drawn. "We're in trouble," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "What are we going to do?" Lily didn't have an answer, but one thing was clear: the Harringtons' perfect life was unraveling. And if she didn't act soon, she and Henry would be caught in the crossfire. Chapter 6. The ritual's aftermath. The days that followed the detective's visit were tense and uneasy. The Harrington house, once a picture of quiet perfection, now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Lily could feel the weight of her parents' watchful eyes, their scrutiny more intense than ever. She avoided the basement at all costs, the memory of what she had seen there haunting her every waking moment. But it wasn't just the basement she feared, it was the change in her parents. Eleanor was colder than usual, her smiles brittle and her tone sharp. She seemed to be constantly on edge, her movements quick and purposeful as she went about her daily tasks. Victor, on the other hand, was quieter, his presence heavy and brooding. He spent hours in his study, the door locked, and Lily could hear the faint sound of his voice drifting through the house, though she could never make out the words. Henry retreated further into himself, his already quiet demeanor turning almost ghostly. He clung to Lily like a lifeline, following her around the house and seeking comfort in her presence. But even she couldn't reassure him anymore. The fear had taken root in both of them, growing with each passing day. One afternoon, while their parents were occupied, Lily and Henry sat in their bedroom, the door closed and locked behind them. "Do you think they'll do it again?" Henry whispered, his voice trembling. Lily hesitated, her stomach churning at the thought. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we can't let them. We have to do something." "Like what?" Henry asked, his eyes wide with fear. Lily bit her lip, her mind racing. She didn't have a plan, but she knew they couldn't just sit back and wait for the next ritual. "We have to find out what they're doing," she said finally. "And we have to stop them." Henry nodded slowly, his face pale but determined. That night, after the house had fallen silent, Lily crept out of her bedroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She had waited until her parents were asleep, their slow, even breaths echoing through the hallway. Henry had wanted to come with her, but she had insisted he stay behind. This was too dangerous for him, and she couldn't risk both of them getting caught. She made her way to her father's study, her footsteps light and quick. The door was locked, but she had come prepared. She pulled a bobby pin from her hair and bent it into shape, her hands trembling as she worked the lock. It took a few tries, but eventually she heard the soft click of the latch releasing. She pushed the door open and slipped inside, the darkness enveloping her like a shroud. The study was exactly as she remembered it, bookshelves lined with leather-bound tomes, a large desk in the center of the room, and an air of quiet authority that made her skin crawl. She moved quickly, her flashlight casting a narrow beam of light as she searched the desk drawers. There were stacks of papers, bills, and receipts, but nothing out of the ordinary. She was about to give up when she noticed a small, ornate box tucked away in the corner of the bottom drawer. Her hands shook as she lifted it out, the wood smooth and cool beneath her fingers. The box was locked, but the lock was old and rusted, and it gave way with a little pressure. Inside, she found a stack of photographs and a small, leather-bound journal. The photographs made her stomach turn. They were of young girls, their faces pale and frightened, their eyes wide with terror. And in every photo, her parents were there, their expressions calm and detached. She opened the journal, her heart pounding as she began to read. The pages were filled with her father's precise handwriting, detailing the rituals and their purpose. The more she read, the more the horror sank in. Her parents were practicing an ancient, forbidden ritual, a sacrifice to maintain their wealth and power. The girls they had taken were chosen for their innocence, their lives snuffed out to feed the darkness her parents had embraced. Lily's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, her mind reeling. How long had this been going on? How many girls had they taken? And how had she and Henry survived? The questions swirled in her mind, but one thing was clear: she couldn't let this continue. She stuffed the journal into the waistband of her pajamas and closed the box, returning it to the drawer as quietly as she could. She slipped out of the study and back to her bedroom, her heart racing. Henry was waiting for her, his face pale and anxious. "What did you find?" he whispered. Lily didn't answer. She handed him the journal, her hands still shaking. Henry's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages, his breath catching in his throat. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "We're going to stop them," Lily said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. "No matter what it takes." Chapter 7. The Hidden Journal. The journal became their most closely guarded secret. Lily and Henry hid it under a loose floorboard in their closet, a place they were certain their parents would never look. Every night, after the house had fallen silent, they would pull it out and read it together, huddled under the dim glow of a flashlight. The more they read, the more their horror grew. The journal was meticulous, filled with details of rituals, sacrifices, and the dark forces their parents had aligned themselves with. The entries spanned years, each one more chilling than the last. Their parents weren't just practicing these rituals, they were masters of them. The journal explained how the sacrifices were calculated, how the girls were chosen, and how the rituals ensured the Harringtons' continued prosperity. It also detailed the punishments for defiant stories of those who had tried to stop them in the past, and what had happened to them. Lily's stomach turned as she read about the fate of a man who had once tried to expose them. His name was scribbled out, but the journal made it clear he hadn't survived. How could they do this? Henry whispered one night, his voice trembling as he closed the journal. Lily shook her head, her own hands trembling. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we have to stop them." We can't let them hurt anyone else." The next day, while their parents were out of the house, Lily and Henry took a risk. They used the key they'd found in their father's study to unlock the basement door. The air was cold and damp as they descended the stairs, the faint smell of earth and something metallic filling their nostrils. Lily's flashlight flickered as they reached the bottom, casting long shadows on the walls. The basement was as she remembered it, the blood-stained floor, the symbols on the walls, the circle of salt in the center of the room. Henry hesitated at the edge of the circle, his face pale. "What do we even do with this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily didn't have an answer, but she began photographing everything with her phone, the symbols, the bloodstains, the altar. "Evidence," she said. "If we can't stop them, maybe we can at least make sure someone else can." They were about to leave when Henry noticed something in the corner of the room, a small, tattered bag half buried in the dirt. He pulled it out, his hands shaking as he opened it. Inside were personal belongings, a hairbrush, a necklace, a crumpled photograph of a smiling girl. Lily's heart sank as she realized what it was. "They keep trophies," she whispered, her voice thick with disgust. "They keep trophies of what they've done." That evening, as they sat in their bedroom, Lily and Henry pored over the photographs and the contents of the bag. The necklace was engraved with a name, Emily. Lily's stomach churned as she remembered the missing girl the detective had mentioned. "They're not going to stop," Henry said quietly. "Not unless we make them." Lily nodded, her mind racing. "We need a plan," she said. "Something they won't see coming." But the truth was, she didn't know where to start. Their parents were meticulous, calculating, and ruthless. Confronting them directly was out of the question. They'd never let her and Henry live to tell the tale. They needed help, but who could they trust? The journal had made it clear that the Harringtons had eyes everywhere. The next morning, as Lily and Henry sat at the breakfast table, their parents seemed unervingly normal. Eleanor was humming softly as she flipped pancakes, and Victor was reading the newspaper, his expression calm and composed. Lily couldn't help but notice the faint red stain on his cuff again, barely visible against the white fabric of his shirt. Her stomach churned, and she pushed her plate away, her appetite gone. "Not hungry, Lily?" Eleanor asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Lily shook her head, forcing herself to meet her mother's gaze. "Just not feeling well," she said quietly. Eleanor studied her for a moment before smiling. "Well, maybe some fresh air will help. Why don't you and Henry go for a walk after breakfast?" It wasn't a suggestion, and Lily knew it. She nodded, her heart pounding. A walk would give her and Henry a chance to talk, but it would also put them under their parents' scrutiny. As they left the house, Lily felt the weight of their eyes on her back, the silent reminder that they were always being watched. Chapter 8. The breaking point, the air outside was crisp and sharp, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Lily pulled her coat tighter around her as she and Henry walked down the quiet suburban street. The houses around them were picture-perfect, their neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences masking the darkness hidden within. But Lily knew better now. The entire town was a carefully constructed facade, and her parents were at the center of it all. "We need to find out who that detective was," Lily said, her voice low. "He was asking questions. Maybe he knows something." Henry nodded, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "But how do we find him?" he asked. "We can't exactly ask Mom and Dad." Lily bit her lip, her mind racing. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly, though she wasn't nearly as confident as she sounded. They rounded the corner and stopped in their tracks. Parked at the end of the street was a familiar black car, its tinted windows reflecting the pale sunlight. A man leaned against the hood, his arms crossed over his chest. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through them. Instinctively, Lily reached for Henry's hand, her heart pounding in her chest. "Lily and Henry Harrington," the man said as they approached. His voice was deep and gravelly, sending a chill down Lily's spine. I've been looking for you. Lily stepped in front of Henry protectively, her eyes narrowing. Who are you? She demanded, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Name's Marcus, the man said, straightening up. I was a friend of Detective Grayson's. Lily's heart skipped a beat. Was? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus hesitated, his expression grim. Let's just say he won't be asking any more questions, he said quietly. Lily's blood ran cold. What do you want? She asked, her voice shaking. Marcus glanced around before stepping closer, lowering his voice. I know everything, he said. About your parents, the sacrifices, all of it. And I know what they're planning next. Lily's breath caught in her throat. So do something, she hissed. You're the police, aren't you? Marcus shook his head, his expression dark. It's not that simple, kid. Your parents, they've got people everywhere. Cops, politicians, you name it. They own this town. Then what are we supposed to do? Henry asked, his voice trembling. Marcus hesitated again, his gaze flicking between them. You need to get out, he said finally, before it's too late. Lily shook her head, her mind reeling. We can't just leave, she said. What if they find us? What if they hurt someone else? They will, Marcus said grimly. But if you stay, you're as good as dead. Or worse. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Henry, who looked terrified but nodded. We'll think about it, she said finally, her voice firm. Marcus studied her for a moment before nodding. Good, he said. But don't wait too long. Every day you stay puts you in more danger. They watched in silence as Marcus got back into his car and drove away, the engine purring softly. Lily's mind was racing, her stomach churning with fear and uncertainty. She turned to Henry, her heart aching at the sight of his wide, frightened eyes. What are we going to do? He whispered. Lily took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. We're not running, she said firmly. Not yet. We need to find out what they're planning and stop them. Henry nodded, though he still looked scared. How? He asked. Lily hesitated, her mind racing. Then it hit her. The journal, she said. There's got to be something in there we missed. Some way to stop them. Together, they hurried back to the house, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. But as they reached the front door, it swung open to reveal Eleanor, her arms crossed and her expression terrifyingly calm. Where have you two been? She asked, her voice icy. Lily's heart skipped a beat as she exchanged a quick glance with Henry. Nowhere, she stammered. Just for a walk. Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she studied them, and for a moment Lily was certain she knew. But then her mother smiled a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Well, don't be out too long, she said smoothly. Dinner's almost ready. With that, she turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind her. As Lily and Henry stepped inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But it was too late to turn back now. They had to find a way to stop their parents before it was too late. Chapter 9. The descent the house felt heavier that night, its walls seeming to close in on Lily as she and Henry sat in their bedroom. The journal spread out between them. The journal was their only lead, but every page she flipped through felt like she was drowning deeper in the horror of their parents' actions. The air was thick with tension, and the distant creak of the house settling felt more like a warning than a comfort. She glanced at Henry, who was staring at the journal with wide, unblinking eyes. We need to keep looking, she whispered. There has to be something. What if there's not? Henry's voice was small, shaking. What if we can't stop them? Lily hesitated, her heart aching at the fear in her brother's voice. She reached out and squeezed his hand. We'll think of something, she said firmly, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Their search through the journal grew more frantic, the silence of the house pressing in on them. The entries were cryptic, filled with references to ancient texts and rituals, but one phrase kept cropping up: "The blood of the innocent shall bind the darkness." Lily's stomach churned as she read it aloud. "What does that even mean?" Henry asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Lily admitted, "but I don't like it." She flipped the page, and her breath caught in her throat. There, scrawled in her father's handwriting, was a detailed drawing of a family tree. At the top were their parents' names, and beneath them, their own. But something about it made her skin crawl. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to a line she hadn't noticed before. It connected their parents' names to another name, Eleanor Grace. Someone who had been erased, the ink smudged as if wiped away. "Who's Eleanor Grace?" Henry asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. Lily shook her head, her heart pounding. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think it's important." She turned the page, and her blood ran cold. There, in bold, jagged letters, was the same phrase again: "The blood of the innocent shall bind the darkness." But this time, it was underlined in red ink, and beneath it was a single name: Emily, the girl whose necklace they had found in the basement. "They're planning something," Lily whispered, her voice shaking. "Something worse than before." Henry looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to stop them," he said quietly. Lily nodded, her mind racing. "We will," she said firmly. "But first, we need to find out what they're planning." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both freeze. Lily quickly snapped the journal shut and shoved it under her bed just as the door creaked open. Their mother stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "What are you two doing up?" she asked, her voice as sweet as poison. "You should be in bed." Lily forced a yawn, hoping her face didn't give her away. "Sorry, Mom," she said. "We were just talking." Eleanor studied them for a moment, her gaze lingering on Henry. "Well, don't stay up too late," she said finally. "You'll need your rest." With that, she closed the door behind her, leaving the room in silence. Lily waited until she heard her mother's footsteps fade down the hallway before letting out a shaky breath. "We're running out of time," she whispered. Henry nodded, his face pale. "What do we do?" Lily's mind raced, her stomach churning with fear and determination. "We need to find out who Eleanor Grace is," she said finally. "And we need to go back to the basement." Henry's eyes widened. "Are you crazy?" he hissed. "Did you forget what happened last time?" "Of course not," Lily snapped, her voice trembling. "But we don't have a choice. There's something down there, something that can help us." "I know it." Henry hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes, but he finally nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "But if we're doing this, we need to be careful." The house was eerily quiet as they crept downstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The basement door loomed in front of them, the air around it unnaturally cold. Lily hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Ready?" she whispered. Henry nodded, though he didn't look ready at all. The moment she opened the door, a rush of cold air swept past them, carrying with it the faint smell of earth and something metallic. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as they descended the stairs, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. The basement was exactly as they had left it, the blood-stained floor, the symbols etched into the walls, the altar in the center of the room. But something was different. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. "What are we looking for?" Henry whispered, his voice trembling. Lily shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's here. I can feel it." She moved further into the room, her flashlight beam sweeping over the walls. And then she saw it, a small, hidden compartment in the corner of the room, its edges barely visible in the dim light. Her heart leapt into her throat as she knelt down and pried it open. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it, her hands trembling, and began to read. The words were faded, the handwriting shaky, but the message was clear. The ritual requires the blood of the innocent 3 souls to bind the darkness forever. Lily's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. She looked up at Henry, her heart pounding in her chest. "We're not next," she whispered. "We're the key." And then the lights went out. Chapter 10. The final sacrifice. The darkness in the basement was suffocating, pressing in on Lily from all sides. She froze, her heart pounding as she clutched the old leather-bound book to her chest. "Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response. Panic surged through her as she fumbled with her flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. "Henry," she called again, louder this time. Still nothing. And then she heard it, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps on the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat as a pale, flickering light filled the room, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the stairs, a candle in one hand and a knife in the other. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made Lily's blood run cold. "You shouldn't be down here, Lily," she said, her voice soft but laced with menace. Lily stumbled back, her mind racing. "Where's Henry?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Eleanor tilted her head, a small, chilling smile playing on her lips. "He's safe," she said. "For now." Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around, searching for a way out. But the basement was a trap, and she was at its center. "Why are you doing this?" Lily asked, her voice breaking. "We're your children." Eleanor's smile faded, replaced by a look of grim determination. "This is bigger than you, Lily," she said. "Bigger than all of us. The ritual must be completed, or the darkness will consume everything." Lily shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You're lying," she whispered. "This is about power. It's always been about power." Eleanor's expression hardened. "You don't understand," she said coldly. "This is survival. For our family. For our legacy." She took a step closer, the candlelight casting eerie shadows on her face. Lily backed up until she hit the wall, her mind racing. The book in her hands felt heavy, its weight a reminder of the secrets it held. She glanced down at it, her heart pounding. And then she saw it, a passage she hadn't noticed before, scrawled in the margins in faded ink. "The cycle can be broken, but at great cost. The blood of the guilty shall sever the bond." Her breath caught in her throat as she looked up at Eleanor, her mind racing. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "There's another way." Eleanor froze, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice sharp. Lily straightened, her hands clutching the book tightly. "The ritual doesn't have to end with us," she said. "There's another way to break the cycle." Eleanor's grip on the knife tightened, her expression darkening. "Lily, don't be foolish," she said. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I do," Lily shouted, her voice cracking. "I've read the journal. I've seen what you've done. And I know how to stop it." Eleanor's eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe, or anger. "You're just a child," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're meddling with." Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her hands trembling. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice pleading. "We don't have to be bound to this darkness anymore." Eleanor hesitated, her grip on the knife faltering for a moment. And in that moment, Lily saw her chance. She lunged forward, grabbing the knife from her mother's hand. Eleanor stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock. "Lily!" she screamed, but Lily didn't stop. She turned and ran to the center of the room, her heart pounding as she knelt beside the salt circle. The journal had mentioned it. The circle was the heart of the ritual, the source of its power. If she could break it, she could break the cycle. Eleanor lunged at her, but Lily was faster. She plunged the knife into the center of the circle, the blade sinking into the blood-stained floor. The air around her seemed to freeze, the shadows twisting and writhing as a low, guttural growl filled the room. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she looked up, her eyes wide with terror. The darkness was alive, a swirling mass of shadows and whispers that seemed to pulse with rage. Eleanor let out a scream, her body convulsing as the shadows closed in around her. "Lily!" she cried, her voice filled with pain and desperation. "Stop it! You don't know what you're doing." But Lily didn't stop. She pressed the knife deeper, her hands trembling as the shadows grew thicker, more oppressive. And then, with a deafening roar, the darkness exploded. The force of it knocked Lily off her feet, sending her sprawling to the ground. She covered her head as debris rained down around her, the air thick with dust and smoke. When she finally opened her eyes, the room was silent. The shadows were gone, the salt circle shattered, and the air felt lighter, freer. Eleanor lay motionless on the ground, her eyes closed and her face pale. Lily crawled over to her, her heart pounding. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was no response. And then Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, her expression soft and filled with something Lily hadn't seen in a long time. "Love. You did it," Eleanor whispered, her voice weak. "You broke the cycle." Tears streamed down Lily's face as she reached out and took her mother's hand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you." Eleanor shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "You saved us," she said. "All of us." The sound of footsteps on the stairs made Lily look up. Henry stood at the bottom, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lily smiled through her tears. "It's over," she said. "We're free." The Devil's Nursery. Chapter 1. The Farmhouse of Shadows. The Ashford farmhouse stood alone in the vast expanse of the countryside, a relic of a bygone era. Its weathered wooden planks groaned under the weight of years, and its roof sagged, heavy with moss and neglect. The fields surrounding it were barren, the earth cracked and lifeless, as though the land itself had been cursed. At night, the farmhouse seemed to come alive, its windows glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light that flickered like the pulse of a dying thing. Gregory and Helena Ashford were the current caretakers of this decaying estate, the latest in a long line of Ashfords to occupy the house. They were a pair that seemed carved from the same stone, cold, unyielding, and unervingly silent. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, as though they had long since surrendered their humanity to something far older and far darker. They moved through the house with an almost mechanical precision, their every action deliberate, their every word measured. The Ashford children, 15-year-old Eleanor, 12-year-old Thomas, and 6-year-old Benjamin, were the only signs of life in the otherwise desolate home. Eleanor was quiet and withdrawn, her eyes always downcast, as though she feared looking up. Thomas was restless, pacing the halls like a caged animal, his hands twitching with nervous energy. Benjamin, the youngest, was the most unsettling of all. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a whisper that seemed to come from somewhere far away. Benjamin's behavior had always been strange, but lately it had taken a turn for the worse. He had begun to speak to things that no one else could see, his small face twisting into expressions of fear or anger as he carried on one-sided conversations in the middle of the night. His drawings, once innocent scribbles, had become twisted, nightmarish visions, shapeless figures with too many eyes. Forests of shadowy trees, and symbols that looked like they had been pulled from a forgotten language. The household's nights were plagued by screams piercing, inhuman wails that seemed to echo from the very walls. Gregory and Helena would rush to Benjamin's room, their faces grim, and lock themselves inside with him. When they emerged, their hands were stained with something dark and sticky, and Benjamin would be unervingly calm, his wide eyes gleaming with something that was not entirely human. The air in the house was thick with the scent of decay, though no one could quite pinpoint its source. It lingered in the corners of the rooms, clung to the curtains, and seeped into the food, making every meal taste faintly of rot. The Ashford parents seemed unaffected, eating their meals with the same stoic expressions they always wore. The children, however, picked at their plates, their appetites withering under the oppressive atmosphere. The farmhouse's history was a shadowy thing, whispered about in the nearby town but never spoken aloud in the Ashford home. The land had been in the family for generations, passed down from parent to child with a reverence that bordered on obsession. There were rumors of unspeakable things happening on the property, of rituals performed under the light of the full moon, of sacrifices made to appease something ancient and hungry. But the Ashfords never spoke of such things, and the townsfolk were too afraid to ask. Gregory and Helena's devotion to their children was unquestionable, but it was not the kind of love that brought warmth or comfort. They treated their offspring as though they were precious vessels, their every action dictated by a set of rules that seemed to have no clear purpose. The children were educated at home, their lessons consisting of strange, archaic texts that spoke of gods no one had heard of and rituals that made no sense. They were rarely allowed outside, and when they were, it was only under the watchful eyes of their parents. One evening, Eleanor found a book hidden in the attic, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The cover was adorned with a symbol that made her stomach churn, a twisting, serpent-like shape that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of her candle. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling, and found illustrations of people in grotesque poses, their bodies contorted in agony. The text was in a language she couldn't read, but the images were enough to make her slam the book shut and shove it back into its hiding place. Thomas, meanwhile, had begun to have nightmares, visions of a dark, formless thing that lurked in the corners of his room. Its presence felt more than seen. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, and find claw marks on his arms that he couldn't explain. When he told his parents, they merely nodded, their expressions unreadable, and told him to pray. Pray for what, they didn't say, but Thomas had a sinking feeling he already knew. Benjamin, however, was at the center of the family's growing tension. His once rare episodes of odd behavior had become frequent, his small body convulsing as though he were possessed. During one such episode, he recited words in a guttural, inhuman voice, his eyes rolling back in his head. Gregory and Helena watched with a mixture of fear and awe, their hands clasped as though in prayer. When Benjamin finally collapsed, limp and unconscious, they carried him to his room with a reverence that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the farmhouse seemed to tighten its grip on the Ashford family. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the whispers that had once been faint became impossible to ignore. The children began to feel it, a presence that watched them from the corners of their rooms, a weight that pressed down on their chests as they slept. It was something ancient, something hungry, and it was waiting for them. Waiting for the night when the line between the living and the dead would blur, and the Ashfords would finally fulfill their destiny. Chapter 2. The first offering the night was heavy with a silence that felt unnatural, as though the world itself had paused to watch what was about to unfold. The farmhouse loomed in the darkness, its windows dark except for the faint glow of candlelight flickering from the kitchen. Gregory and Helena Ashford moved through the house with a sense of purpose, their footsteps echoing softly on the creaking wooden floors. They carried bundles of herbs, candles, and an ancient leather-bound book whose pages crackled like dry leaves. Eleanor and Thomas huddled in their rooms, their doors locked as their parents' whispered prayers drifted through the halls. The words were unfamiliar, guttural, and sharp, spoken in a language that felt alien and wrong. Benjamin, however, was awake, sitting cross-legged on his bed. His small face was eerily calm, his eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. A faint, unnatural smile played on his lips, as though he were privy to some terrible secret. Gregory and Helena entered Benjamin's room without knocking, their faces shadowed but their eyes gleaming with a fervent intensity. They dressed him in a robe of deep crimson, its fabric rough and ancient, the hem stained with dark, crusted spots. Benjamin obeyed without protest, his movements stiff and mechanical, as though he were being guided by some unseen force. He didn't speak, but his smile never wavered. The family descended into the barn, their footsteps muffled by the oppressive silence of the night. The barn was a place of shadows and secrets, its walls lined with tools rusted from neglect and shelves bowed under the weight of forgotten things. At its center stood an altar, carved from blackened wood and etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. Gregory and Helena placed Benjamin before the altar, his small frame dwarfed by the monstrous structure. They lit candles, their flames casting long, shifting shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. The parents began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, the words ancient and unholy. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the candles' flames began to burn a sickly shade of green. From the corner of the barn, Eleanor and Thomas watched, hidden behind a stack of crates. They had followed their parents, driven by a morbid curiosity that now felt like a terrible mistake. Their hearts pounded in their chests, their breaths shallow and panicked as they watched the ritual unfold. Thomas clutched Eleanor's hand, his fingers trembling, but she didn't pull away. They were bound together by fear, by the unspoken understanding that they were witnessing something they were never meant to see. Gregory produced a small, writhing animal, a rabbit, its eyes wide with terror, and held it over the altar. Helena handed him a knife, its blade curved and jagged, its edge gleaming in the green light. The chanting grew louder, more fervent, the words twisted and guttural, echoing through the barn like the voices of the damned. Benjamin stood perfectly still, watching with an unsettling calm, his smile never faltering. In one swift motion, Gregory slit the rabbit's throat. Its blood spilled onto the altar, pooling in the grooves of the carved symbols, and the flames of the candles flared unnaturally high. The shadows in the barn seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing, converging around Benjamin. The air was filled with a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Eleanor stifled a scream, her hand clamping over her mouth as the shadows engulfed Benjamin. For a moment, he was lost to them, his small form disappearing into the darkness. When the shadows receded, he was still standing, but he was no longer the same. His eyes were black, fathomless voids, and his smile had widened into something grotesque and unnatural. The mark on his wrist, the sigil that had appeared after his first episode, glowed faintly, its twisting vein-like pattern now spread across his entire body. Gregory and Helena fell to their knees, their heads bowed in reverence. They whispered prayers of gratitude to their deity, their voices trembling with a mix of awe and fear. The air grew still, the candles' flames returning to their natural color, and the barn was once again silent. But the sense of dread lingered, thicker and heavier than before. Benjamin turned to his siblings, his black eyes locking onto theirs. He didn't speak, but his smile said enough. It was a smile of knowing, of triumph, as though he had already accepted his role in whatever dark plan their parents had set in motion. Eleanor and Thomas fled, their footsteps echoing through the barn as they ran back to the farmhouse, their hearts pounding with terror. Alone in the barn, Gregory and Helena rose to their feet, their faces grim but resolute. They cleaned the altar with practiced efficiency, their movements mechanical and devoid of emotion. The blood was wiped away, the candles extinguished, and the barn returned to its usual state of disrepair. But the mark on Benjamin's body remained, glowing faintly in the darkness, a permanent reminder of what had transpired. The first offering had been made, and the wheels of their unholy plan were now in motion. Chapter 3. The child's mark. The morning after the ritual, the farmhouse was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of the Ashford children moving about or the soft clatter of breakfast being prepared were absent. The air was heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Benjamin sat at the kitchen table, his small hands folded neatly in front of him. His robe from the night before was gone, replaced by ordinary clothes, but the mark on his wrist remained, its twisting vein-like pattern now spreading up his forearm. Eleanor and Thomas watched him from the doorway, their fear palpable. Benjamin's behavior was unsettling. He wasn't screaming or speaking in that strange, guttural voice anymore. Instead, he was calm, eerily so. His expression blank but for the faint, knowing smile that never quite left his lips. When their parents entered the room, they ignored the tension, moving about the kitchen with their usual stoic efficiency. "Benjamin," Helena said, her voice soft but firm. "How are you feeling?" Benjamin turned to her, his black eyes glinting in the morning light. He didn't speak, but his smile widened slightly, sending a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Gregory placed a hand on Benjamin's shoulder, his expression unreadable, and muttered something under his breath, a prayer or a warning. Eleanor couldn't tell. Throughout the day, Benjamin's presence became increasingly unnerving. He would sit for hours in the same spot, staring at nothing, his smile never wavering. His siblings tried to avoid him, but it was impossible. He seemed to be everywhere, his small figure appearing in doorways or at the edges of their vision, always watching, always smiling. Even the animals on the farm avoided him, the chickens scattering as he walked past, the dog whining and hiding under the porch. Eleanor tried to distract herself by helping with chores, but her hands trembled as she scrubbed dishes or swept floors. Her mind kept drifting back to the barn, to the shadows that had swallowed Benjamin whole, to the mark that now seemed to pulse faintly on his skin. She wanted to ask her parents what was happening, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. The fear of their response was too great. Thomas, meanwhile, was growing increasingly restless. He spent most of his time pacing the halls or wandering the fields, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. The nightmares had returned, worse than before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing, a dark, shapeless mass looming over him, its presence suffocating, its intentions unknowable. He tried to shake it off, but the fear lingered, a constant weight on his chest. That evening, Benjamin spoke for the first time since the ritual. They were sitting at the dinner table, the silence broken only by the clinking of forks on plates, when Benjamin suddenly said, "They're coming." His voice was soft but clear, and it cut through the silence like a knife. Gregory and Helena froze, their hands gripping their utensils tightly. Eleanor and Thomas exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding. "Who's coming, Benjamin?" Gregory asked, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. Benjamin didn't respond, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. His smile widened slightly, and he began to hum a low, tuneless sound that sent a chill through the room. Helena reached for his hand, her fingers brushing the mark on his wrist, and whispered something in that ancient, guttural language. Later that night, Eleanor found herself standing in front of Benjamin's door, her heart pounding. She told herself she was just checking on him. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She needed to see him, to confirm that he was still her little brother beneath the black eyes and the eerie smile. She pushed the door open slowly, wincing as it creaked, and peered inside. Benjamin was sitting on his bed, his back to the door. His room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the mark on his arm. He was drawing, his hand moving swiftly across the page, the scratching of the pencil the only sound. Eleanor stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the drawing, a figure with too many eyes, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Beneath it were symbols, identical to the ones etched into the altar in the barn. "Benjamin," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond, his hand continuing to move across the page. She reached out to touch his shoulder, but the moment her fingers made contact, he turned to her. His eyes were black, his smile unnaturally wide, and for a moment she thought she saw something else, a shadow, shifting and writhing beneath his skin. She stumbled back, her heart racing, and fled the room. As she lay in bed that night, Eleanor couldn't shake the image of Benjamin's black eyes, the way they seemed to pierce through her, as though he could see into her very soul. The house was silent, but she could feel it, the presence that had been growing stronger since the ritual, the thing that was waiting, watching. Benjamin's words echoed in her mind. "They're coming." She didn't know what it meant, but one thing was certain: the Ashford family was no longer alone in the farmhouse. Something had been awakened, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed them all. Chapter 4. The shadows whisper the days that followed the ritual were marked by an oppressive stillness, as though the farmhouse were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the whispers that had once been faint became impossible to ignore. Eleanor and Thomas felt it the most, a presence that lingered just out of sight, watching them with a hunger that was almost palpable. Benjamin, however, seemed to thrive in it, his black eyes gleaming with a sinister light, his smile never wavering. Eleanor began to notice strange things around the house, small, subtle changes that defied explanation. Objects would move on their own, disappearing from one room and reappearing in another. The walls seemed to breathe, the wooden planks creaking and groaning as though the house itself were alive. At night, she would hear footsteps in the halls, slow and deliberate, but when she opened her door, no one was there. The fear kept her awake, her hands clutching the blankets as she stared at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. Thomas, meanwhile, was plagued by visions that bled into his waking hours. He would see the shadowy figure from his nightmares lurking in the corners of his room, its formless body shifting and writhing as it reached for him. The scratches on his arms grew deeper, the wounds fresh and oozing despite no memory of how they got there. He tried to tell his parents, but they dismissed his concerns with a cold indifference, their eyes distant and unfeeling. Benjamin's mark continued to spread, the twisting vein-like pattern now covering his chest and back. He no longer spoke, communicating only through his eerie smile and the occasional hum that sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. He spent most of his time in his room, drawing the same grotesque figures and symbols over and over again. When Eleanor tried to take the drawings away, Benjamin would scream a piercing, inhuman sound that made her blood run cold. One night, Eleanor woke to find Benjamin standing at the foot of her bed, his black eyes fixed on her, his smile unnaturally wide. She froze, her heart pounding, as he leaned closer, his breath cold against her skin. "They're here," he whispered, his voice guttural and distorted. She screamed, and her parents rushed into the room, their faces grim as they carried Benjamin away. He didn't resist, his smile never faltering, but the fear lingered, settling deep in Eleanor's chest. The next morning, Gregory and Helena announced that they would be leaving for the day, their voices calm but their eyes sharp with urgency. They instructed Eleanor and Thomas to stay in the house, warning them not to leave under any circumstances. As their parents' car disappeared down the dirt road, the siblings exchanged a glance, their unease growing. The farmhouse felt different without them, larger, darker, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Eleanor and Thomas spent the day huddled together in the living room, their nerves frayed as they listened to the whispers that seemed to come from the walls. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and writhe, their forms indistinct but menacing. Benjamin stayed in his room, his humming growing louder and more discordant, the sound echoing through the house like a warning. As night fell, the whispers grew louder, the words muffled but tinged with malice. Eleanor and Thomas tried to ignore them, their hands clasped tightly as they sat on the couch, but the fear was overwhelming. The air grew colder, their breaths visible as they exhaled, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the house was plunged into darkness. Eleanor fumbled for a flashlight, her hands trembling as she switched it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it did little to dispel the fear. The whispers grew louder, the words forming sentences that sent chills down their spines. "You belong to us," the voices hissed, their tone cold and mocking. "You cannot escape." Thomas grabbed Eleanor's arm, his grip tight as they made their way to the kitchen, the flashlight casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. They found Benjamin sitting at the table, his back to them, his humming growing louder. The mark on his body glowed faintly, its twisting pattern pulsing in the darkness. Eleanor called his name, her voice trembling, but he didn't respond. As they approached him, the whispers grew deafening, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of malice. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, converging around Benjamin as he turned to face them. His black eyes glinted in the flashlight's beam, his smile wider than ever. "They're here," he said, his voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. The shadows lunged, engulfing the room in darkness. When the light returned, Benjamin was gone, the kitchen empty except for the faint glowing outline of his mark on the floor. Eleanor and Thomas stood frozen, their hearts pounding, as the whispers faded into silence. The house was still, but the presence was stronger than ever, its hunger palpable. They were no longer alone in the farmhouse. The shadows had claimed Benjamin, and they were coming for the rest. Chapter 5. The hollow ground. The morning after Benjamin's disappearance, Eleanor and Thomas sat in the kitchen, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. The house was unnervingly quiet, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. They had searched every room, every corner, but Benjamin was gone, vanished without a trace. The faint, glowing outline of his mark on the kitchen floor was the only evidence that he had ever been there, and even that seemed to fade as the sun rose. Gregory and Helena returned that afternoon, their expressions unreadable as they listened to Eleanor and Thomas's frantic explanation. They didn't seem surprised, nor did they show any emotion. Instead, they exchanged a glance, their eyes cold and calculating, before Gregory muttered something under his breath, a phrase in that ancient guttural language that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. Helena placed a hand on his arm, her touch brief but meaningful, and they retreated to their bedroom without another word. Eleanor and Thomas were left alone in the kitchen, their fear and confusion mounting. They couldn't understand their parents' indifference, the way they seemed to accept Benjamin's disappearance as though it were inevitable. The siblings knew they couldn't rely on their parents for answers, so they made a silent pact to find the truth themselves. Whatever was happening in the farmhouse, whatever had taken Benjamin, they were determined to uncover it. That night, Eleanor crept into the attic, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under her weight as she searched for the strange book she had found weeks earlier. It was still there, hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, its cover adorned with the same twisting, serpent-like symbol that made her stomach churn. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling, and found illustrations of rituals, sacrifices, and symbols identical to those on the altar in the barn. Thomas joined her, his face pale as he examined the book. The text was in a language they couldn't read, but the images were enough to make their blood run cold. There were drawings of people marked with the same twisting patterns as Benjamin, their bodies contorted in agony. There were diagrams of the barn, the altar, and something beneath it, a dark, cavernous space filled with symbols and bones. The siblings exchanged a glance, their fear mirrored in each other's eyes. The next morning, they ventured into the barn, their footsteps echoing softly as they approached the altar. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe as they moved. Thomas pointed to the ground beneath the altar, his voice trembling as he whispered, "There's something down there." They knelt, brushing away the dirt and straw, and found a trapdoor, its wood warped and heavy with age. It took all their strength to lift the trapdoor, the hinges groaning in protest as it swung open. A set of rickety wooden stairs descended into darkness, the air below cold and damp. Eleanor hesitated, her heart pounding, but Thomas grabbed her hand, his grip tight as he whispered, "We have to know." Together, they descended the stairs, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they stepped into the cavern below. The cavern was vast, its walls lined with symbols carved into the stone, their twisting patterns identical to those in the book. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the ground was littered with bones, animal and human alike, their remains scattered as though they had been discarded. In the center of the cavern stood another altar, its surface stained dark with blood, and around it were candles, their wax melted and pooled on the ground. Eleanor's flashlight fell on something in the corner of the cavern, a pile of clothes, torn and bloodied, their fabric stiff with age. She recognized them instantly. They belonged to the Ashford children who had come before her, the ones her parents had rarely spoken of. The siblings had always assumed they had moved away or died of illness, but now the truth was clear. They had been sacrificed, their deaths part of the ritual to appease whatever lurked in the shadows. Thomas's flashlight flickered, the beam growing dim as the air grew colder. The shadows in the cavern seemed to shift, their forms indistinct but menacing. The whispers returned, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of malice. "You cannot escape," they hissed, their tone cold and mocking. "You belong to us." The siblings stumbled back, their hearts pounding, as the shadows closed in around them. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's arm, pulling him toward the stairs as the shadows lunged, their forms twisting and writhing. The whispers grew deafening, the voices echoing through the cavern as they climbed, their hands slipping on the damp steps. The trapdoor slammed shut above them, plunging them into darkness, but they didn't stop, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they scrambled to the surface. When they emerged, the barn was silent, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The siblings collapsed on the ground, their bodies trembling as they struggled to catch their breath. The truth was clear: the farmhouse, the rituals, the sacrifices, it was all part of something far older and far darker than they could have imagined. The shadows had claimed Benjamin, and now they were coming for the rest. The Ashford children were not meant to survive. They were meant to be consumed. Chapter 6. The marked path. Eleanor and Thomas sat in the kitchen, their faces pale and their hands trembling as they tried to process what they had seen in the cavern. The discovery of the other Ashford children's belongings had confirmed their worst fears: their family was part of something monstrous, something that demanded blood and sacrifice. The book from the attic lay open on the table, its pages filled with rituals and symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The siblings knew they couldn't wait for their parents to act. They had to find a way to stop the darkness before it claimed them too. Eleanor flipped through the book, her eyes scanning the pages for anything that might help them. The text was still incomprehensible, but some of the diagrams were clear: circles of protection, wards against evil, and symbols designed to banish the darkness. She pointed to one of the illustrations, a circle with intricate runes drawn around it. "If we can do this," she whispered, her voice trembling, "maybe we can protect ourselves." Thomas nodded, though his fear was evident in his wide eyes and clenched fists. They spent the next few hours gathering materials: salt, candles, herbs, and chalk, anything they could find that might help them recreate the protective circle. The house seemed to resist their efforts, objects disappearing or moving out of reach, and the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. The shadows deepened, stretching across the walls and floor as though trying to block their path, but the siblings pressed on, their determination outweighing their fear. By nightfall, they were ready. The living room had been cleared of furniture, and the protective circle had been carefully drawn on the floor, its runes precise and exact. The candles were lit, their flames casting a soft, warm glow that seemed to push back the oppressive darkness. The siblings stood in the center of the circle, their hands clasped tightly as they whispered the words they had found in the book: a prayer or incantation. They weren't sure, but it felt like their only hope. The moment they began to speak, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned and creaked, the floorboards shifting beneath their feet as the whispers turned to screams. The shadows surged, their forms twisting and writhing as they clawed at the edges of the circle, their malevolence palpable. The siblings held their ground, their voices growing louder as they repeated the words, their hands trembling but their resolve unshaken. The shadows grew denser, their forms coalescing into shapes that were almost human, their eyes glowing with a sickly light, their mouths twisted into grotesque grins. The air grew colder, their breaths visible as they exhaled, and the candles' flames flickered, their light dimming as the darkness pressed in. For a moment, it seemed as though the circle would hold, but then one of the candles sputtered and went out. The moment the flame died, the shadows surged forward, breaking through the circle with a force that sent Eleanor and Thomas sprawling. The protective runes were smeared, their power diminished, and the siblings scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding as the shadows closed in around them. The whispers became deafening, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of malice and triumph. "You cannot escape," they hissed, their tone cold and mocking. "You belong to us." Eleanor grabbed Thomas's hand, pulling him toward the stairs as the shadows lunged, their forms twisting and writhing. They ran to her room, slamming the door behind them and barricading it with every piece of furniture they could find. The shadows pressed against the door, their forms shifting and writhing as they tried to force their way in. The siblings huddled in the corner, their bodies trembling as they waited for the darkness to claim them. Hours passed, and the house grew quiet. The shadows receded, the whispers faded, and the air grew warmer. The siblings remained in the room, their fear keeping them rooted to the spot. When the sun rose, they ventured out cautiously, their bodies stiff and their eyes wary. The living room was empty, the circle smeared and the candles extinguished, but the shadows were gone for now. Eleanor and Thomas knew they couldn't stay in the farmhouse any longer. The protective circle had failed, and their parents offered no help or comfort. They needed to leave, to escape the darkness that threatened to consume them. They packed what little they could carry: clothes, food, the book, and prepared to flee. The whispers returned as they stepped outside, their voices faint but menacing. "You cannot escape," they hissed, their tone cold and mocking. "You belong to us." The siblings ignored the whispers, their footsteps quickening as they made their way toward the dirt road that led away from the farm. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. They ran, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the farmhouse receded behind them. For a moment, it seemed as though they might escape, but then Benjamin appeared in front of them, his small form blocking their path. Benjamin's black eyes gleamed in the sunlight, his smile unnaturally wide as he whispered, "You cannot escape." The mark on his body glowed faintly, its twisting pattern pulsing with an otherworldly light. The shadows surged around him, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in around the siblings. Eleanor and Thomas were trapped, their escape cut off by the darkness they had tried to flee. The marked path had led them here, and now they had nowhere left to run. Chapter 7. The broken circle. Eleanor and Thomas stood frozen in the dirt road, their hearts pounding as Benjamin's black eyes locked onto theirs. His smile was unnaturally wide, the mark on his body glowing faintly as the shadows surged around him, their forms twisting and writhing. The siblings backed away, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, but Benjamin stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You cannot escape," he whispered, his voice guttural and distorted, the sound sending a chill down their spines. Eleanor clutched Thomas's hand, her grip tight as she tried to think of a way out. The shadows were closing in around them, their forms indistinct but menacing, their whispers overlapping in a cacophony of malice. The farmhouse loomed behind them, its windows dark and lifeless, but they knew there was no safety there. Their only hope was to face the darkness head-on, even if it meant confronting Benjamin or whatever he had become. "Benjamin," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but firm. "Please, let us go. We are your family." Benjamin tilted his head, his smile widening slightly, but he didn't respond. The mark on his body pulsed faintly, its twisting pattern glowing brighter as the shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing as they reached for the siblings. Eleanor and Thomas stumbled back, their fear threatening to overwhelm them, but they held their ground. Thomas pulled the book from his bag, its cover adorned with the same serpent-like symbol that made his stomach churn. He flipped through the pages frantically, his eyes scanning the text for anything that might help them. The illustrations of the protective circle caught his eye, and he pointed to them, his voice trembling as he whispered, "We need to try again." Eleanor nodded, her fear mirrored in her wide eyes, and they began to gather sticks and stones from the ground, their hands trembling as they arranged them into a rough circle. The shadows surged closer, their forms twisting and writhing as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. The siblings knelt in the center of the circle, their hands clasped tightly as they began to whisper the incantation they had found in the book. The words felt strange and heavy on their tongues, their voices trembling as they repeated them, their fear palpable. The moment they began to speak, the shadows recoiled, their forms shifting and writhing as though in pain. The air grew colder, their breaths visible as they exhaled, and the whispers turned to screams, the voices filled with rage and desperation. The circle seemed to hold, its power pushing back the darkness, but Benjamin stepped closer, his black eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "You cannot escape," Benjamin whispered, his voice guttural and distorted. He reached out, his small hand brushing the edge of the circle, and the runes smeared, their power diminished. The shadows surged forward, breaking through the circle with a force that sent Eleanor and Thomas sprawling. The protective runes were smeared, their power diminished, and the siblings scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding as the shadows closed in around them. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's hand, pulling him toward the farmhouse as the shadows lunged, their forms twisting and writhing. They ran, their footsteps echoing softly as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and triumph. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless, but they knew there was no safety there, only more darkness. They burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind them and barricading it with every piece of furniture they could find. The shadows pressed against the door, their forms shifting and writhing as they tried to force their way in. The siblings huddled in the corner, their bodies trembling as they waited for the darkness to claim them. Hours passed, and the house grew quiet. The shadows receded, the whispers faded, and the air grew warmer. The siblings remained in the corner, their fear keeping them rooted to the spot. When the sun rose, they ventured out cautiously, their bodies stiff and their eyes wary. The living room was empty, the circle smeared and the candles extinguished, but the shadows were gone for now. Eleanor and Thomas knew they couldn't stay in the farmhouse any longer. The protective circle had failed, and their parents offered no help or comfort. They needed to leave, to escape the darkness that threatened to consume them. They packed what little they could carry: clothes, food, the book, and prepared to flee. The whispers returned as they stepped outside, their voices faint but menacing. "You cannot escape," they hissed, their tone cold and mocking. "You belong to us." The siblings ignored the whispers, their footsteps quickening as they made their way toward the dirt road that led away from the farm. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. They ran, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the farmhouse receded behind them. For a moment, it seemed as though they might escape, but then Benjamin appeared in front of them, his small form blocking their path. Chapter 8. The darkest hour. Benjamin stood in the middle of the dirt road, his small form blocking their escape. His black eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light, and the mark on his body pulsed faintly, its twisting pattern glowing brighter as the shadows surged around him. Eleanor and Thomas froze, their hearts pounding as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. The air grew colder, their breaths visible as they exhaled, and the siblings knew they had no choice but to face the darkness head-on. "Benjamin," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but firm, "please, let us go. We are your family." Benjamin tilted his head, his smile widening slightly, but he didn't respond. The mark on his body pulsed faintly, its twisting pattern glowing brighter as the shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing as they reached for the siblings. Eleanor and Thomas stumbled back, their fear threatening to overwhelm them, but they held their ground. Thomas pulled the book from his bag, its cover adorned with the same serpent-like symbol that made his stomach churn. He flipped through the pages frantically, his eyes scanning the text for anything that might help them. The illustrations of the protective circle caught his eye, and he pointed to them, his voice trembling as he whispered, "We need to try again." Eleanor nodded, her fear mirrored in her wide eyes, and they began to gather sticks and stones from the ground, their hands trembling as they arranged them into a rough circle. The shadows surged closer, their forms twisting and writhing as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. The siblings knelt in the center of the circle, their hands clasped tightly as they began to whisper the incantation they had found in the book. The words felt strange and heavy on their tongues, their voices trembling as they repeated them, their fear palpable. The moment they began to speak, the shadows recoiled, their forms shifting and writhing as though in pain. The air grew colder, their breaths visible as they exhaled, and the whispers turned to screams, the voices filled with rage and desperation. The circle seemed to hold, its power pushing back the darkness, but Benjamin stepped closer, his black eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "You cannot escape," Benjamin whispered, his voice guttural and distorted. He reached out, his small hand brushing the edge of the circle, and the runes smeared, their power diminished. The shadows surged forward, breaking through the circle with a force that sent Eleanor and Thomas sprawling. The protective runes were smeared, their power diminished, and the siblings scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding as the shadows closed in around. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's hand, pulling him toward the farmhouse as the shadows lunged, their forms twisting and writhing. They ran, their footsteps echoing softly as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and triumph. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless, but they knew there was no safety there, only more darkness. They burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind them and barricading it with every piece of furniture they could find. The shadows pressed against the door, their forms shifting and writhing as they tried to force their way in. The siblings huddled in the corner, their bodies trembling as they waited for the darkness to claim them. Hours passed, and the house grew quiet. The shadows receded, the whispers faded, and the air grew warmer. The siblings remained in the corner, their fear keeping them rooted to the spot. When the sun rose, they ventured out cautiously, their bodies stiff and their eyes wary. The living room was empty, the circle smeared and the candles extinguished, but the shadows were gone for now. Eleanor and Thomas knew they couldn't stay in the farmhouse any longer. The protective circle had failed, and their parents offered no help or comfort. They needed to leave, to escape the darkness that threatened to consume them. They packed what little they could carry: clothes, food, the book, and prepared to flee. The whispers returned as they stepped outside, their voices faint but menacing. "You cannot escape," they hissed, their tone cold and mocking. "You belong to us." The siblings ignored the whispers, their footsteps quickening as they made their way toward the dirt road that led away from the farm. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. They ran, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the farmhouse receded behind them. For a moment, it seemed as though they might escape, but then Benjamin appeared in front of them, his small form blocking their path. Benjamin's black eyes gleamed in the sunlight, his smile unnaturally wide as he whispered, "You cannot escape." The mark on his body glowed faintly, its twisting pattern pulsing with an otherworldly light. The shadows surged around him, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in around the siblings. Eleanor and Thomas were trapped, their escape cut off by the darkness they had tried to flee. The darkest hour had come, and now they had nowhere left to run. Chapter 9. The final sacrifice. Eleanor and Thomas stood frozen in the dirt road, their hearts pounding as Benjamin's black eyes locked onto theirs. The shadows surged around him, their forms twisting and writhing as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. The mark on Benjamin's body glowed faintly, its twisting pattern pulsing with an otherworldly light. The siblings knew they had no choice but to face the darkness head-on, even if it meant confronting Benjamin or whatever he had become. "Benjamin," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but firm, "please, let us go. We are your family." Benjamin tilted his head, his smile widening slightly, but he didn't respond. The mark on his body pulsed faintly, its twisting pattern glowing brighter as the shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing as they reached for the siblings. Eleanor and Thomas stumbled back, their fear threatening to overwhelm them, but they held their ground. Thomas pulled the book from his bag, its cover adorned with the same serpent-like symbol that made his stomach churn. He flipped through the pages frantically, his eyes scanning the text for anything that might help them. The illustrations of the protective circle caught his eye, and he pointed to them, his voice trembling as he whispered, "We need to try again." Eleanor nodded, her fear mirrored in her wide eyes, and they began to gather sticks and stones from the ground, their hands trembling as they arranged them into a rough circle. The shadows surged closer, their forms twisting and writhing as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. The siblings knelt in the center of the circle, their hands clasped tightly as they began to whisper the incantation they had found in the book. The words felt strange and heavy on their tongues, their voices trembling as they repeated them, their fear palpable. The moment they began to speak, the shadows recoiled, their forms shifting and writhing as though in pain. The air grew colder, their breaths visible as they exhaled, and the whispers turned to screams, the voices filled with rage and desperation. The circle seemed to hold, its power pushing back the darkness, but Benjamin stepped closer, his black eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "You cannot escape," Benjamin whispered, his voice guttural and distorted. He reached out, his small hand brushing the edge of the circle, and the runes smeared, their power diminished. The shadows surged forward, breaking through the circle with a force that sent Eleanor and Thomas sprawling. The protective runes were smeared, their power diminished, and the siblings scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding as the shadows closed in around them. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's hand, pulling him toward the farmhouse as the shadows lunged, their forms twisting and writhing. They ran, their footsteps echoing softly as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and triumph. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless, but they knew there was no safety there, only more darkness. They burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind them and barricading it with every piece of furniture they could find. The shadows pressed against the door, their forms shifting and writhing as they tried to force their way in. The siblings huddled in the corner, their bodies trembling as they waited for the darkness to claim them. Hours passed, and the house grew quiet. The shadows receded, the whispers faded, and the air grew warmer. The siblings remained in the corner, their fear keeping them rooted to the spot. When the sun rose, they ventured out cautiously, their bodies stiff and their eyes wary. The living room was empty, the circle smeared and the candles extinguished, but the shadows were gone for now. Eleanor and Thomas knew they couldn't stay in the farmhouse any longer. The protective circle had failed, and their parents offered no help or comfort. They needed to leave, to escape the darkness that threatened to consume them. They packed what little they could carry: clothes, food, the book, and prepared to flee. The whispers returned as they stepped outside, their voices faint but menacing. "You cannot escape," they hissed, their tone cold and mocking. "You belong to us." The siblings ignored the whispers, their footsteps quickening as they made their way toward the dirt road that led away from the farm. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. They ran, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the farmhouse receded behind them. For a moment, it seemed as though they might escape, but then Benjamin appeared in front of them, his small form blocking their path. Benjamin's black eyes gleamed in the sunlight, his smile unnaturally wide as he whispered, "You cannot escape." The mark on his body glowed faintly, its twisting pattern pulsing with an otherworldly light. The shadows surged around him, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in around the siblings. Eleanor and Thomas were trapped, their escape cut off by the darkness they had tried to flee. The final sacrifice had come, and now they had nowhere left to run. Chapter 10. The last light. Benjamin stood before them, his small frame blocking their path, his black eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. The mark on his body pulsed faintly, its twisting pattern glowing brighter as the shadows surged around him, their forms twisting and writhing. Eleanor and Thomas were trapped, their escape cut off by the darkness they had tried to flee. The whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and triumph, and the siblings knew they had no choice but to face the curse head-on. "Benjamin," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but firm, "please, let us go. We are your family." Benjamin tilted his head, his smile widening slightly, but he didn't respond. The mark on his body pulsed faintly, its twisting pattern glowing brighter as the shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing as they reached for the siblings. Eleanor and Thomas stumbled back, their fear threatening to overwhelm them, but they held their ground. Thomas pulled the book from his bag, its cover adorned with the same serpent-like symbol that made his stomach churn. He flipped through the pages frantically, his eyes scanning the text for anything that might help them. The illustrations of the protective circle caught his eye, and he pointed to them, his voice trembling as he whispered, "We need to try again." Eleanor nodded, her fear mirrored in her wide eyes, and they began to gather sticks and stones from the ground, their hands trembling as they arranged them into a rough circle. The shadows surged closer, their forms twisting and writhing as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. The siblings knelt in the center of the circle, their hands clasped tightly as they began to whisper the incantation they had found in the book. The words felt strange and heavy on their tongues, their voices trembling as they repeated them, their fear palpable. The moment they began to speak, the shadows recoiled, their forms shifting and writhing as though in pain. The air grew colder, their breaths visible as they exhaled, and the whispers turned to screams, the voices filled with rage and desperation. The circle seemed to hold, its power pushing back the darkness, but Benjamin stepped closer, his black eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "You cannot escape," Benjamin whispered, his voice guttural and distorted. He reached out, his small hand brushing the edge of the circle, and the runes smeared, their power diminished. The shadows surged forward, breaking through the circle with a force that sent Eleanor and Thomas sprawling. The protective runes were smeared, their power diminished, and the siblings scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding as the shadows closed in around them. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's hand, pulling him toward the farmhouse as the shadows lunged, their forms twisting and writhing. They ran, their footsteps echoing softly as the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and triumph. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless, but they knew there was no safety there, only more darkness. They burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind them and barricading it with every piece of furniture they could find. The shadows pressed against the door, their forms shifting and writhing as they tried to force their way in. The siblings huddled in the corner, their bodies trembling as they waited for the darkness to claim them. Hours passed, and the house grew quiet. The shadows receded, the whispers faded, and the air grew warmer. The siblings remained in the corner, their fear keeping them rooted to the spot. When the sun rose, they ventured out cautiously, their bodies stiff and their eyes wary. The living room was empty, the circle smeared and the candles extinguished, but the shadows were gone for now. Eleanor and Thomas knew they couldn't stay in the farmhouse any longer. The protective circle had failed, and their parents offered no help or comfort. They needed to leave, to escape the darkness that threatened to consume them. They packed what little they could carry: clothes, food, the book, and prepared to flee. The whispers returned as they stepped outside, their voices faint but menacing. "You cannot escape," they hissed, their tone cold and mocking. "You belong to us." The siblings ignored the whispers, their footsteps quickening as they made their way toward the dirt road that led away from the farm. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the whispers grew louder, their voices filled with malice and anger. They ran, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the farmhouse receded behind them. For a moment, it seemed as though they might escape, but then Benjamin appeared in front of them, his small form blocking their path. Benjamin's black eyes gleamed in the sunlight, his smile unnaturally wide as he whispered, "You cannot escape." The mark on his body glowed faintly, its twisting pattern pulsing with an otherworldly light. The shadows surged around him, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in around the siblings. Eleanor and Thomas were trapped, their escape cut off by the darkness they had tried to flee. The last light had come, and now they had nowhere left to run. The Hollow Family. Chapter 1. The compound in the woods. The woods were ancient, their gnarled trees towering like silent sentinels over the narrow, muddy path that led to the Hollow family compound. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, and the silence was unnerving. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. It was as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting. The deeper one ventured, the heavier the fog became, wrapping around the trees like a shroud and obscuring the sunlight until it was nothing more than a faint, gray haze. The compound emerged from the mist like a beast rising from the shadows. It was a sprawling estate, its once grand facade now crumbling and weather-beaten. The wooden planks of the exterior were warped and splintered, and patches of moss clung to the walls like open wounds. The windows were dark, their panes cracked and dusty, and the front door loomed ominously, its surface carved with intricate, twisting symbols that seemed to shift when stared at too long. Silas Hollow stood at the edge of the clearing, his tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the fog. His jet-black hair fell to his shoulders in greasy strands, and his piercing eyes scanned the woods with an unsettling intensity. He wore a long, tattered coat that seemed to blend with the shadows, and in his hands he held a jagged knife, its blade catching the faint light as he traced strange symbols into the bark of a nearby tree. The symbols pulsed faintly, as though alive, and Silas whispered under his breath in a language that sounded guttural and ancient. Lydia Hollow stood a few feet away, her presence almost as unsettling as her husband's. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the dim light, and her hair, a cascade of fiery red, framed her face like a halo. She wore a flowing blood-red dress that trailed behind her as she moved, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth. Her eyes, a striking shade of green, held a predatory glint as she watched her husband work, her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. The Hollow children stood in a semicircle behind their parents, their faces blank and their eyes hollow. There were 5 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 16, but they all shared the same unnerving stillness, as though they were more statues than living beings. The youngest, a little girl named Lila, clutched a doll with no eyes, its face smeared with what looked like dried blood. The oldest, a boy named Jonah, held a rope coiled tightly in his hands, his knuckles white from the grip. Ilara, a young girl of 12, stood apart from the others, her heart pounding in her chest. She was new to the compound, having been brought here by Silas and Lydia just a few months ago. They had found her on the streets, starving and alone, and had promised her a family, a purpose. At first, she had been grateful, but now, as she watched Silas carve the symbols into the trees and heard the low, guttural whispers of the deity they worshipped, she felt a deep, gnawing fear in the pit of her stomach. "Tonight," Silas said, his voice echoing through the clearing, "we will perform the first cleansing. The world outside is corrupt, and it is our duty to purify it. The blood of the unworthy will feed our God, and through their sacrifice we will be reborn." The children nodded in unison, their faces betraying no emotion, but Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't fully understand what Silas meant by cleansing, but the way he said it, his voice dripping with reverence, made her insides twist with dread. Lydia stepped forward, her movements graceful and deliberate. She placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder, her touch cold yet oddly comforting. "You will play an important role tonight, my dear," she said, her voice soft but laced with authority. "It is an honor to serve our God. Do you understand?" Ilara nodded, though her heart was racing. She didn't know what was expected of her, but she knew better than to question Lydia. The woman's gaze was as sharp as a blade, and Ilara had seen what happened to those who defied her. The family began to move, their footsteps almost silent as they made their way to the center of the clearing. In the middle of the space stood a large stone altar, its surface stained dark with what Ilara could only assume was blood. Surrounding the altar were 7 torches, their flames flickering unnaturally, casting long, dancing shadows across the ground. Silas and Lydia took their places at the head of the altar, while the children formed a circle around it. Ilara's breath came in shallow gasps as she watched Silas raise the jagged knife above his head, his eyes closed in prayer. The air grew heavy, and a low, rumbling sound began to emanate from the earth, as though the ground itself was awakening. The symbols on the trees began to glow faintly, their light pulsating in time with Silas's chants. The other children joined in, their voices rising in unison, but Ilara couldn't bring herself to speak. She felt as though the air around her was pressing in, suffocating her. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke through the chanting. Ilara turned her head and saw a man stumbling into the clearing, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He was wearing a tattered jacket and muddy boots, and he looked as though he had been running for hours. Silas's eyes snapped open, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Ah," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "our first offering has arrived." The man tried to back away, but the hollow children moved as one, their movements swift and practiced. Jonah threw the rope around the man's neck, yanking him to the ground, while the others pinned him down. Ilara watched in horror as Silas approached, the knife glinting in the torchlight. The man's screams pierced the night, but they were quickly drowned out by the chanting of the hollow family. Ilara felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't move, didn't speak. She knew there was no escape, not for the man, and not for her. Chapter 2. The journalist's arrival. Mara Voss had always been drawn to the shadows. As an investigative journalist, she prided herself on uncovering the darkest corners of society, but this case was different. Over the past year, 5 people had gone missing in the rural town of Black Hollow. Hikers, campers, and even a local teenager, all vanishing without a trace. The police had no leads, and the townsfolk whispered rumors of a family living deep in the woods, a family no one dared to name. Mara's curiosity burned brighter than her fear, and she was determined to find the truth, no matter the cost. The drive to Black Hollow was long and lonely, the winding road cutting through dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The town itself was small and unassuming, its buildings weathered and its streets nearly deserted. Mara parked her car outside the local diner, the only place that seemed to have any life, and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, and every head in the room turned to stare at her. The air was thick with tension, and the silence that followed her entrance was deafening. She approached the counter, where an elderly man with a bushy beard and a stained apron was wiping down a glass. "I'm looking for information about the missing persons cases," she said, her voice steady but firm. The man's expression darkened, and he set the glass down with a heavy thud. "You best leave that alone," he said, his voice low and gruff. "Folks who go pokin' around those woods don't come back." Mara narrowed her eyes, undeterred. "I'm not afraid of the woods," she replied. "Or what's in them." The man leaned closer, his breath sour and his eyes narrowed. "You should be," he said. "The Hollows, they ain't like you and me. They're different, and they don't take kindly to strangers." Mara's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her composure. "The Hollows," she repeated. "Who are they?" The man shook his head and turned away, refusing to say more. Frustrated, Mara left the diner, the weight of his warning lingering in the air. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. Mara pulled her jacket tighter around her and checked the map she had annotated with the locations of the disappearances. All of them had occurred near a dense patch of forest to the east of town, the same area the locals had been warning her about. She glanced at the sky, where dark clouds were gathering, and made her decision. She would go to the woods. The path into the forest was narrow and overgrown, the trees so thick that they blocked out most of the light. The air grew colder as she walked, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her footsteps crunching on the damp leaves. She could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on her, as though the trees themselves were watching her every move. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but she pressed on, driven by a mix of determination and unease. After what felt like hours, she emerged into a clearing, and there it was, the Hollow family compound. The sight of the crumbling estate sent a shiver down her spine, its dark windows and twisted symbols on the door making her stomach churn. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but then she saw movement. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a man with piercing eyes and long, unkempt hair. "Silas Hollow." "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something unnatural. "We don't often have visitors." Mara forced a smile, though her heart was pounding. "I'm a journalist," she said, holding up her press badge. "I'm investigating the disappearances in the area, and I was hoping you could answer a few questions." Silas's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he said. "We have nothing to hide. Come inside." The interior of the compound was just as unsettling as the exterior. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and something metallic, and the walls were lined with strange, unsettling paintings depicting rituals and sacrifices. Mara's skin crawled as she followed Silas into a dimly lit sitting room, where a woman with fiery red hair was waiting. Lydia Hollow. Her gaze was sharp and calculating, and Mara felt as though she were being dissected under it. "This is my wife, Lydia," Silas said, gesturing to the woman. "And these are our children." Mara's eyes fell on the group of children standing in the corner. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow, and they stared at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She forced herself to smile and held out her hand to Lydia. "It's nice to meet you," she said. Lydia's hand was cold, her grip firm. "Likewise," she replied, though her tone was anything but welcoming. Silas offered Mara a seat and began to answer her questions, his responses carefully measured and evasive. He spoke of their simple, self-sufficient lifestyle and their devotion to their faith, but Mara couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. Her eyes kept drifting to the children, who hadn't moved or spoken since she arrived. There was something deeply unsettling about them, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As the conversation dragged on, Mara began to feel light-headed, her vision blurring at the edges. She reached for her glass of water, but her hand trembled and she knocked it over. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she stammered, but Silas and Lydia's smiles only widened. "It's quite all right," Lydia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Why don't you rest for a while? You look tired." Mara tried to protest, but the room spun around her, and darkness clawed at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw was the Hollow family standing over her, their smiles cold and predatory, before everything went black. Chapter 3. The first cleansing. Mara awoke to the sound of chanting, her head pounding and her vision blurry. She was lying on a cold, hard surface, her wrists bound with rough rope that bit into her skin. Panic surged through her as she struggled to sit up, her eyes darting around the room. She was in a large, circular chamber lit only by the flickering light of torches mounted on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense and something metallic, something that made her stomach turn. The chanting grew louder, echoing off the stone walls, and Mara realized with a sinking feeling that she was no longer alone. The Hollow family stood in a circle around her, their faces illuminated by the torchlight. Silas and Lydia were at the head of the circle, their expressions serene yet eerily intense. The children stood behind them, their eyes blank and their movements unerringly synchronized. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the symbols carved into the walls, the same ones she had seen on the trees outside. "You're awake," Silas said, his voice calm and measured. "Good. We were beginning to worry." Mara tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and her words came out as a croak. "What's going on?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. Silas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You are about to witness something extraordinary," he said. "A cleansing. The world outside is corrupt, and it is our duty to purify it. Through sacrifice, we honor our God and ensure our rebirth." Mara's blood ran cold as the weight of his words sank in. She looked around the room, searching for an escape, but the only exit was a heavy wooden door bolted shut. The Hollow children stepped forward, their movements mechanical and precise. They carried a large stone basin between them, its surface stained dark with what Mara could only assume was blood. They set it down in front of her, and the metallic smell grew stronger, making her gag. Lydia stepped forward, her expression serene but her eyes gleaming with something dark and predatory. "Do not fear," she said, her voice soft but laced with authority. "Your sacrifice will serve a greater purpose. Our God demands blood, and through your offering, we will be reborn." Mara's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing for a way out. "You can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "People will come looking for me." Silas chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "No one ever comes looking," he said. "The woods take care of that." You are ours now, and there is no escape." He reached into his coat and pulled out a jagged knife, its blade glinting in the torchlight. Mara's breath quickened as he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. She tried to wrench her wrists free, but the ropes were too tight, and the pain only made her head spin. The chanting grew louder, the words guttural and ancient, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate with energy. The torches flickered wildly, their flames casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow faintly, their light pulsating in time with the chanting. Mara's skin crawled as she felt something shift in the air, something dark and malevolent. Silas raised the knife above his head, his eyes closed in prayer, and the chanting reached a deafening crescendo. Mara's vision blurred, and she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room seemed to tilt and spin, and she felt as though she were falling into a darkness that had no end. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, and the room fell silent. Mara blinked, her vision clearing, and she saw Silas standing over her, the knife still raised. But something was different. His face was twisted in pain, his hands trembling, and the blade slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. The hollow children gasped, their blank expressions replaced with shock and fear. Lydia stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Silas," she said, her voice trembling. "What's wrong?" Silas didn't answer. He clutched his chest, his breaths coming in shallow gasps, and collapsed to his knees. The symbols on the walls dimmed, and the air in the room grew still. Mara stared in stunned silence as the Hollow family rushed to Silas's side, their movements frantic and panicked. "It's the god Jonah," the oldest son said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's rejecting him." Lydia's face twisted with fury, and she turned to Mara, her eyes blazing. "You," she hissed, "you did this. You've disrupted the ritual. Our god demands sacrifice, and it will not be denied." She picked up the fallen knife and advanced on Mara, her movements swift and deadly. Mara's heart raced as she struggled against the ropes, her mind screaming for escape. Just as Lydia raised the knife, the heavy wooden door burst open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was a man, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. The Hollow family froze, and Mara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know who he was or why he was here, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Chapter 4. The children's initiation. The man who had burst through the door stood frozen in place, his chest heaving and his eyes wide with terror. He was young, no older than 20, with messy brown hair and a face pale with fear. The Hollow family turned toward him, their expressions shifting from shock to predatory glee. Lydia lowered the knife but kept it clutched tightly in her hand, her lips curling into a slow, cruel smile. "Another offering," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Mara's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold, her mind racing. The man stumbled back, his hands raised in surrender, but the Hollow children moved quickly, surrounding him with eerie precision. Lila, the youngest, held her eyeless doll in one hand and a length of rope in the other, her expression disturbingly blank. Jonah stepped forward, his grip tight on a rusty hook that gleamed in the torchlight. "Please," the man stammered, his voice trembling. I got lost. I didn't mean to." Silas, still kneeling on the ground, let out a low, guttural laugh. "Lost," he repeated, his voice weak but mocking. "There are no accidents in the eyes of our God. You were brought here for a reason." He struggled to his feet, his movements slow and pained, and leaned heavily on Lydia for support. Mara's eyes darted between him and the man, her thoughts spinning. If she could distract them, maybe she could find a way out, but the ropes around her wrists were tight, and the Hollow children were everywhere. Lydia stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the man. "Kneel," she commanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. The man hesitated, but Jonah jabbed him with the hook, and he fell to his knees with a cry of pain. Mara's stomach churned as she watched, her dread growing with every passing second. The Hollow family moved in closer, their chanting starting again, low and guttural, like the growl of an animal. Silas raised his hand, and the chanting stopped. His face was pale, his breathing labored, but his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. "Tonight," he said, his voice weak but laced with authority, "we will complete the initiation. Our youngest must learn the ways of the god, and there is no greater lesson than sacrifice." He gestured to Lila, who stepped forward, her doll clutched tightly to her chest. Lydia knelt beside the man, her knife pressed against his throat. He whimpered, his eyes wide with fear, but she didn't flinch. "Lila," she said, her tone soft but commanding, "this is your moment. You must take the first step toward your rebirth." Lila nodded, her expression disturbingly calm, and reached out to take the knife from her mother. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was about to happen. The man's cries grew louder, but the Hollow family ignored him, their focus entirely on Lila. The youngest child stepped forward, her small hands trembling slightly as she gripped the knife. She looked at her father, her eyes wide and questioning. "Silas," she whispered, "will it hurt?" Silas nodded, his expression solemn. "Yes," he said, "but pain is a gift. It purifies the soul." The man screamed as Lila raised the knife, her face set with determination. Mara squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch, but the sound that followed made her stomach churn. The man's screams turned to gurgles, and the room filled with the metallic scent of blood. When Mara opened her eyes, Lila was standing over the man's body, the knife still clutched in her hand. Her dress was stained red, but her expression was disturbingly calm. Silas stepped forward, his hand resting on Lila's shoulder. "You have done well," he said, his voice filled with pride. "The god is pleased." The Hollow children nodded in unison, their faces blank but their eyes gleaming with something Mara couldn't quite place. She realized with a sinking feeling that this was normal for them, that they had been raised to see this as a sacred duty, not a crime. Lydia turned to Mara, her smile cold and calculating. "You are fortunate," she said. "The god has chosen to spare you for now. But you must prove your worth. Will you join us, or will you become another offering?" Mara's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to play along to buy herself time, but the thought of participating in their rituals made her feel sick. "I'll join you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I want to understand." Lydia's smile widened, and she stepped forward, her knife glinting in the torchlight. "Good," she said. "But first, you must prove your loyalty." She handed the knife to Mara, her gaze intense. "Take it," she commanded. "Complete the sacrifice." Mara's hands trembled as she took the knife, the weight of it heavy in her grip. She looked down at the man's body, her stomach churning, and then at the Hollow family, their eyes burning with expectation. She knew she had no choice if she refused. She would die, but as she raised the knife, she vowed that she would find a way to escape. No matter what it took. Chapter 5. The journalist's plan. Mara's hands trembled as she held the knife, the weight of it heavy in her grip. The man's lifeless body lay before her, his blood pooling on the stone floor, and the Hollow family watched with unblinking eyes, their expressions a mix of anticipation and hunger. She knew she had to act. Playing along was her only chance of survival, but the thought of slicing into his flesh made her stomach churn. She took a deep breath, her mind racing for a way out of this nightmare. "Do it," Lydia commanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. Mara hesitated, her throat tightening, and then she plunged the knife into the man's chest, her stomach lurching as the blade sank into flesh. The Hollow family erupted into a low, guttural chant, their voices echoing through the chamber, but Mara's mind was elsewhere. She focused on the feel of the knife in her hand, the metallic scent of blood in the air, and the cold, calculating eyes of the Hollows. She was a journalist. She had trained herself to observe, to analyze, and now, more than ever, she needed to keep her wits about her. When the ritual was over, Silas stepped forward and placed a hand on Mara's shoulder, his touch cold and clammy. "You have done well," he said, his voice weak but approving. "The god is pleased." Mara forced a nod, her hands still shaking, and handed the knife back to Lydia. The hollow children stared at her with blank expressions, their eyes hollow and unsettling, but Mara noticed something in their faces, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even fear. She tucked that observation away, knowing it might prove useful later. Lydia led Mara to a small, dimly lit room at the edge of the compound, its walls lined with shelves filled with jars of herbs, bones, and other unsettling objects. "You will stay here," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "For now, you are one of us, but trust must be earned. Do not attempt to leave. The woods are not kind to those who wander alone." Mara nodded, her heart pounding, and watched as Lydia closed the door behind her, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the silence. Alone at last, Mara sank to the floor, her legs giving way beneath her. She buried her face in her hands, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and tried to steady her racing thoughts. She had survived the ritual, but at what cost? The man's blood was still on her hands, both literally and metaphorically, and the weight of what she had done threatened to crush her. But she couldn't afford to break down, not now. She had to think, to plan, to find a way out of this nightmare. She stood and began to explore the room, her eyes scanning the shelves for anything that might help her escape. The jars held strange, unrecognizable contents, their labels written in a language she couldn't read, but tucked away in a corner, she found a dusty book bound in cracked leather. She opened it cautiously, her fingers trembling, and found pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches, rituals, symbols, and what appeared to be a family history. Mara's heart raced as she flipped through the pages, her eyes widening at what she discovered. The Hollow family had been practicing their dark rituals for generations, each initiation bloodier and more twisted than the last. There were notes about the deity they worshipped, a being they called the Hollow One, and the sacrifices required to sustain its power. Mara's stomach churned as she read about the children's initiation ceremonies, the gruesome details etched into the pages in meticulous handwriting. She froze when she found a passage about Silas's decline. "The Hollow One grows restless," it read. "Its chosen vessel weakens, and the blood of strangers no longer satisfies. A new offering must be made, a sacrifice of greater significance." Mara's blood ran cold as she realized what this meant. Silas was no longer able to sustain their god, and the Hollows were desperate for a replacement. She knew, with a sinking feeling, that she was their next target. Mara closed the book and tucked it under her arm, her mind racing. She needed to find a way out, but how? The compound was a maze, and the forest outside was a death trap. She thought back to the Hollow children, their blank expressions and the flicker of fear she had seen in their eyes. Could she use that to her advantage? They were victims, too, in their own way, raised in this twisted world and indoctrinated into its horrors. If she could reach them, maybe she could turn them against their parents. The sound of footsteps outside the door jerked Mara from her thoughts. She hurried to replace the book on the shelf and sat back down, her heart pounding. The door creaked open, and Elara, the youngest Hollow daughter, stepped inside, her doll clutched tightly to her chest. Mara forced a smile, her mind racing. "Hey," she said softly. "What's your name?" Elara stared at her with hollow eyes, her expression unreadable, and didn't answer. Mara's heart ached for the girl, but she knew she had to be careful. "Do you ever get scared here?" she asked, her voice gentle. Elara hesitated, her grip tightening on her doll, and then nodded slowly. Mara leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay to be scared," she said, "but we don't have to stay here. We can leave together. Would you like that?" Elara's eyes widened, and for a moment, Mara thought she had gotten through to her. But then the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and Elara's expression hardened. She turned and hurried out of the room, leaving Mara alone once again. Mara sighed, her heart heavy, but she didn't give up hope. She had found a crack in the Hollow family's facade, and if she could widen it, She might just find a way out. Chapter 6. The Children's Rebellion. The following morning, the compound was eerily quiet. Mara sat in her small room, the book of Hollow family secrets clutched tightly in her hands, her mind racing with possibilities. She had spent the night studying its pages, memorizing every ritual, every symbol, and every dark detail of their history. She knew that knowledge was her only weapon, and she was determined to use it to turn the Hollow children against their parents. She was startled by the sound of the door creaking open. Lila stood in the doorway, her doll clutched to her chest, her blank expression replaced by a flicker of something Mara couldn't quite place: curiosity, perhaps, or fear. Mara forced a smile and gestured for the girl to come in. "Hey," she said softly. "Did you want to talk?" Lila hesitated, her small frame tense, and then stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Mara's heart ached as she studied the girl. She was no older than 8, her face pale and her eyes hollow, but there was a spark of something human beneath the surface. Mara knew she had to tread carefully. Lila had been raised in this twisted world, and her loyalty to her family could be hard to break. "Do you ever wonder what it's like outside the woods?" Mara asked, her voice gentle. Lila's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "Mother says the outside world is full of monsters," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mara's heart sank, but she pressed on. "Sometimes, the real monsters are the ones closest to us," she said carefully. "Do you ever feel afraid here?" Lila hesitated, her grip tightening on her doll, and then nodded slowly. Mara leaned forward, her voice soft but urgent. "You don't have to be afraid," she said. "There are people out there who can help us, who can protect us. We could leave here together. Would you like that?" Lila stared at her, her expression unreadable, and then shook her head. "Mother says the woods will kill us if we try to leave," she said. "The Hollow One protects us." Mara's stomach churned at the girl's words, but she didn't give up. She opened the book she had found and turned to a page depicting the Hollow One, a grotesque, shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a gaping maw. "This is your god, isn't it?" she asked. Lila nodded, her expression shifting from curiosity to fear. "What if I told you it's not a god?" Mara continued. "What if it's something else, something that's been lying to you, using you?" Lila's lower lip trembled, and she glanced at the door as if expecting her parents to burst in at any moment. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking. "Mother and Father say the Hollow One is holy." Mara reached out and gently took Lila's hand, her heart breaking for the girl. "Sometimes, people lie to protect themselves," she said. "Even people who love us. But you deserve to know the truth." The door creaked open, and Mara froze. Jonah stood in the doorway, his expression dark and his eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. Lila jumped to her feet, her doll clutched tightly to her chest, and hurried to her brother's side. Mara's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I was just talking to her," she said, her voice steady. "I thought she might want to learn about the outside world." Jonah's eyes narrowed, and he stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "The outside world is corrupt," he said, his voice cold. "Our family is pure, and the Hollow One protects us. If you try to poison her mind again, you'll regret it." Mara's stomach churned, but she held his gaze, her mind racing. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but she couldn't back down now. After Jonah left, Mara sat in silence, her thoughts spinning. She had made progress with Lila, but Jonah was a different story. He was older, more indoctrinated, and fiercely loyal to his family. She knew she needed to find a way to reach him, and fast. Her time was running out, and the Hollow's desperation was growing. That evening, Mara was summoned to the main chamber. The Hollow family stood in a circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the torches. Silas looked weaker than ever, his skin pale and his breathing labored, but his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. "Tonight," he said, his voice weak but commanding, We will perform the offering of renewal. The Hollow One demands a sacrifice of greater significance. Mara's heart pounded as she realized what this meant. The family was preparing for something big, something that could seal her fate. She glanced at the children, their expressions blank but their eyes flickering with unease. She knew she had to act quickly. If she could turn them against their parents, she might just have a chance, but if she failed, the Hollow's darkest ritual would claim her. Chapter 7. The ritual of renewal. The main chamber was eerily quiet as the Hollow family prepared for the offering of renewal. Mara stood in the circle, her hands bound with rough rope, her heart pounding in her chest. The torches cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and something metallic that made her stomach turn. She glanced at the children, their faces blank but their eyes flickering with unease, and knew this was her last chance to turn them against their parents. Silas stepped forward, his skin pale and his movements slow, but his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. "The time has come," he said, his voice weak but commanding. "The Hollow One demands a sacrifice of greater significance. Through this offering, we will ensure our rebirth and the continuation of our legacy." The family nodded in unison, their expressions solemn, but Mara noticed the way Lila's hands trembled and the way Jonah's jaw tightened. Lydia stepped forward, clutching a jagged knife that gleamed in the torchlight. Her gaze locked onto Mara, and she smiled a cold, predatory smile that sent a shiver down Mara's spine. "You have been chosen," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Your blood will honor the Hollow One and ensure our survival." Mara's breath quickened, her mind racing for a way out, but the ropes around her wrists were too tight, and the family was watching her like hawks. As Lydia raised the knife, Mara's heart pounded, and she knew she had to act quickly. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the chamber. The family froze, their eyes narrowing, and Mara forced herself to stay calm. "Before you do this, ask yourselves, what if the Hollow One is lying to you? What if it's not a god, but something else, something that's been using you?" The room fell silent, and for a moment, Mara thought she saw doubt flicker in their eyes. Silas stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. "You dare speak against our God?" he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "You know nothing of its power, its holiness." Mara met his gaze, her voice steady despite her fear. "I've read your book," she said. "I know about the sacrifices, the rituals, the way your family has been feeding it for generations. But what has it given you in return? Look at you, you're weak, dying. Is this what it means to be chosen?" The family exchanged uneasy glances, and Mara pressed on. "Your children deserve better," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "They deserve freedom, a chance to live without fear. Do you really want to trap them in this cycle forever?" Lydia's grip tightened on the knife, and she stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Do not listen to her," she said, her voice sharp. "She is trying to poison your minds, to turn you against the Hollow One. She is nothing but a liar." The family nodded, their expressions hardening, but Mara noticed the way Lila's lower lip trembled and the way Jonah's fists clenched at his sides. She knew she was close, so close, but she needed to push them further. "What if I'm right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if everything you've been told is a lie? Are you willing to risk your children's lives on a god that might not even exist?" Silas lunged forward, his hand gripping Mara's throat, his breaths labored and his eyes wild. "You will not destroy what we have built," he snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "Our faith is unshakable, our purpose clear. The Hollow One will be appeased, and you will be its offering." Mara gasped for air, her vision blurring, but she refused to back down. "Kill me," she croaked, her voice barely audible. "But you'll never silence the truth." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Mara thought she had failed until Lila stepped forward, her small frame trembling but her eyes filled with determination. "What if she's right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The family turned to her, their expressions a mix of shock and anger, and Mara's heart raced. Jonah stepped forward, his jaw tight, and placed a hand on Lila's shoulder. "Don't," he said, his voice low. "Don't let her confuse you." But Lila shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm scared," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't want to hurt anyone anymore." The room fell silent, and Mara's heart pounded as she realized the tide might be turning. Silas released her throat and stepped back, his face pale and his breathing labored. "You are weak," he said, his voice trembling. "You are unworthy of the Hollow One's grace." Lydia stepped forward, her eyes blazing, and raised the knife. "We will not be swayed," she said, her voice cold and unyielding. "The offering will be made, and the Hollow One will be appeased." But before she could strike, Jonah stepped between her and Mara, his expression dark and his hands clenched into fists. "No," he said, his voice low and firm. "Not like this." The room erupted into chaos as the family turned on each other, their voices raised in anger and fear. Mara's heart raced as she realized this was her chance. She twisted her wrists against the ropes, her hands raw and bleeding, but she didn't stop. She had planted the seeds of doubt, and now the Hollow family was tearing itself apart. If she could just break free, she might have a chance to escape to survive. Chapter 8. The escape plan. The chamber erupted into chaos as the Hollow family turned on each other, their voices raised in anger and fear. Silas and Lydia argued fiercely, their faces twisted with rage, while Jonah stood firm, his body shielding Mara from his parents. Lila clung to her brother's side, her small frame trembling but her eyes filled with determination. Mara's heart raced as she twisted her wrists against the ropes, the rough fibers cutting into her skin, but she didn't stop. This was her chance, her only chance. Jonah turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. "Untie her," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're ending this." Mara's breath caught in her throat as Lila stepped forward, her small hands fumbling with the knots. The ropes fell away, and Mara rubbed her raw wrists, her mind racing. "We don't have much time," Jonah said, his voice urgent. "Follow me." He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the door, Lila close behind. They moved quickly through the dimly lit corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Mara's heart pounded as she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting Silas or Lydia to appear at any moment. The compound was a maze of narrow hallways and hidden passages, but Jonah navigated it with ease, his movements quick and deliberate. "Where are we going?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The woods," Jonah replied, his tone grim. "It's the only way out." Mara's stomach churned at the thought of facing the forest again, but she knew she had no choice. They reached a door at the edge of the compound, its wood warped and weathered, and Jonah pushed it open, the cold night air rushing in. Mara hesitated, her heart racing, but Jonah grabbed her hand and pulled her outside. The forest loomed before them, its trees dark and looming, but Jonah didn't stop. He led them through the underbrush, his movements swift and sure, while Lila clung to his side, her doll clutched tightly to her chest. Mara followed closely, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her mind spinning. She couldn't believe it after everything she had been through. She was finally free. But their freedom was short-lived. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, and Mara turned to see Silas and Lydia emerging from the compound, their faces twisted with rage. "Stop!" Lydia screamed, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You cannot run from the Hollow One." Mara's heart pounded as she glanced at Jonah, his expression dark and determined. "Go," he said, his voice urgent. "I'll hold them off." Mara hesitated, her heart aching at the thought of leaving him behind, but Lila grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. "We have to go," the girl said, her voice trembling but firm. Mara nodded, her throat tight, and followed Lila deeper into the woods, the sound of shouting and footsteps fading behind them. The forest was dark and suffocating, but Mara forced herself to keep moving, her mind focused on one thing: survival. They ran until their legs burned and their lungs ached, the trees seeming to close in around them. Mara's heart pounded as she glanced over her shoulder. half expecting to see Silas or Lydia emerging from the shadows. But the forest was silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves and their own ragged breaths. "We need to keep moving," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll find us if we stop." Mara nodded, her throat dry and her legs trembling, but she forced herself to keep going. They stumbled through the underbrush, the darkness pressing in on them, until they reached a narrow stream. The water glistened in the moonlight, its gentle babbling a stark contrast to the horrors they had left behind. Mara knelt by the stream, her hands trembling as she cupped the cold water and brought it to her lips. Lila sat beside her, her doll clutched tightly to her chest, her eyes wide and hollow. Mara's heart ached for the girl, and she reached out to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. "We're going to be okay," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll get us out of here. I promise." Lila nodded, her expression unreadable, but Mara saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. They rested for a few minutes, their bodies aching and their minds spinning, but they knew they couldn't stay still for long. Mara stood and held out her hand to Lila. "Ready?" she asked. The girl nodded and took her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. They crossed the stream and continued through the woods, the trees gradually thinning as the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness. Mara's heart raced as she saw the edge of the forest in the distance, the horizon glowing with the promise of freedom. She turned to Lila, her throat tight with emotion, and squeezed the girl's hand. "We're almost there," she said, her voice trembling with relief. But as they stepped into the clearing, Mara froze. Silas and Lydia stood before them, their faces twisted with rage, and behind them, the dark silhouette of the Hollow family compound loomed like a nightmare come to life. Chapter 9. The final confrontation. Mara's heart stopped as Silas and Lydia emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted with rage and their eyes burning with a feverish intensity. The forest clearing seemed to close in around her, the trees looming like silent sentinels as the first light of dawn painted the sky in pale hues. Lila clutched Mara's hand tightly, her small frame trembling, but her grip was surprisingly strong. Mara forced herself to stay calm, her mind racing for a way to escape or fight back. "You cannot run from the Hollow One," Silas said, his voice weak but dripping with malice. "Its power spans these woods, and its will cannot be denied." Lydia stepped forward, her jagged knife gleaming in the early morning light, and Mara's stomach churned. She glanced at Lila, her heart aching for the girl, and knew she couldn't let them win. She had come too far to give up now. "You're wrong," Mara said, her voice steady despite her fear. "The Hollow One isn't a god, it's a parasite, feeding on your family's fear and desperation. And you're too blind to see it." Lydia's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the knife, and she stepped closer. "You know nothing," she hissed, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You are nothing but an offering, a vessel for its power." Before Mara could respond, a rustling sound came from the woods behind them. She turned to see Jonah emerging from the trees, his face pale and his clothes torn, but alive. Relief flooded her chest, but it was short-lived. Silas and Lydia turned to him, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. "Jonah," Silas said, his voice trembling with rage. "You betrayed us. You betrayed the Hollow One." Jonah stepped forward, his jaw tight and his eyes dark. "I'm ending this," he said, his voice low but firm. "No more sacrifices. No more lies." Lydia let out a guttural scream, her face contorted with fury, and lunged at him. Mara's heart pounded as she grabbed Lila and pulled her aside, watching in horror as the family turned on itself. Jonah wrestled with his mother, his movements swift but strained, while Silas collapsed to the ground, his breathing labored and his face pale. Mara's mind raced as she realized this was her chance. She glanced at Lila, who was watching the chaos with wide, terrified eyes. "Stay here," Mara said, her voice urgent but calm. "I'll be right back." She hurried toward Silas, her heart pounding, and knelt beside him. His eyes were glazed, his skin cold and clammy, but he still managed to sneer at her. "You cannot stop it," he rasped, his voice weak but venomous. "The Hollow One will claim you." Mara's hands trembled as she searched his robes, her mind focused on one thing: the book. If she could destroy it, she might be able to weaken the Hollow family's hold or even destroy it entirely. Her fingers closed around the cracked leather binding, and she pulled it free, her heart racing. Silas let out a weak cry, his hand grasping at the air, but he was too weak to stop her. She stood and turned to Jonah and Lydia, who were still locked in a violent struggle. Lydia's knife flashed in the sunlight, narrowly missing Jonah's chest, but he managed to twist away, his movements desperate but determined. Mara's stomach churned as she realized she had to act quickly. She opened the book and began tearing out the pages, her hands trembling but her movements frantic. The air seemed to shift as the pages fell to the ground, the forest growing unnaturally still. Lydia froze mid-swing, her eyes widening as she turned to Mara. "What have you done?" she screamed, her voice filled with rage and terror. Jonah took advantage of her distraction and knocked the knife from her hand, pinning her to the ground. Mara continued tearing out the pages, her breaths coming in shallow gasps, until the book was nothing but scraps of paper. A low, guttural growl echoed through the woods, and the ground began to tremble beneath Mara's feet. The trees swayed unnaturally, their branches twisting and groaning, and a dark shadow began to form in the center of the clearing. Mara's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. The Hollow One was coming. Jonah grabbed Lila and pulled her away from the shadow, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." Mara hesitated, her eyes glued to the growing darkness, but she knew he was right. She grabbed his hand and ran, Lila close behind, as the shadow began to take shape, its hollow eyes burning with an otherworldly rage. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the forest, the horizon glowing with the promise of freedom. Mara turned to look back, her heart pounding, and saw the Hollow family compound consumed by the shadow, its twisted silhouette crumbling into nothingness. She sank to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she couldn't help the wave of relief that washed over her. It was over. The Hollow One was gone, and she was finally free. Chapter 10. Epilogue. The sun rose over the horizon, its golden light spilling across the field where Mara, Jonah, and Lila had collapsed in exhaustion. The oppressive weight of the woods was behind them, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Mara breathed in clean, fresh air. She leaned against a lone tree, her body aching and her mind still reeling, but a strange sense of peace settled over her. She had survived. Lila sat beside her, her doll clutched tightly to her chest, her wide eyes fixed on the horizon. The girl was quiet, her usual blank expression replaced by a mixture of fear and wonder. Mara reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're safe now," she said softly. "No more rituals. No more sacrifices. Just freedom." Lila nodded slowly, her grip on the doll loosening slightly. Jonah stood a few feet away, his arms crossed and his gaze distant. His face was bruised and scratched from the fight with his mother, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "What now?" he asked, his voice low and thoughtful. Mara sighed and leaned her head back against the tree. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we're alive, and that's enough for now." They stayed there for a while, resting in silence as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Mara's thoughts drifted to the Hollow family compound, now consumed by the shadow of the Hollow One. She wondered if Silas and Lydia had survived or if they, too, had been consumed by the darkness they had worshipped for so long. Part of her felt guilty for not returning to check, but another part knew she could never go back. "We should keep moving," Jonah said, breaking the silence. "There's a town nearby, maybe a few miles east. We can find help there." Mara nodded and forced herself to stand, her legs trembling but holding firm. She held out a hand to Lila, and the girl took it, her small fingers gripping Mara's tightly. Together, they began to walk, their steps slow but steady. The journey was quiet, the field stretching endlessly before them, but Mara's mind was anything but still. She thought about the book she had destroyed, the rituals she had disrupted, and the Hollow One's final, terrifying appearance. She didn't know if it was truly gone or if it was merely weakened, but she hoped it would never harm anyone again. As they walked, Lila began to open up, her voice soft but steady. "What's it like?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "The outside world?" Mara smiled faintly and squeezed the girl's hand. "It's different," she said. "There are good people and bad people, but no one worships shadows or demands sacrifices. You'll see for yourself soon." Lila nodded, her expression thoughtful, and Mara felt a flicker of hope. By midday, they reached the outskirts of a small town. The sight of houses, cars, and people going about their daily lives felt surreal to Mara, like stepping into a dream. Jonah led them to a modest building with a sign that read Community Shelter, and Mara's chest tightened with gratitude. They stepped inside, the warmth and smell of food enveloping them, and a kind-faced woman greeted them with a smile. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice filled with concern. Mara nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and the woman ushered them to a table. She brought them blankets, food, and water, and Mara felt tears prick her eyes as she realized they were safe, truly safe. Lila clung to her side, her doll still clutched tightly, but her eyes were wide with curiosity as she looked around the room. Over the next few days, Mara, Jonah, and Lila began to adjust to their new reality. They were given clean clothes, warm beds, and access to medical care, and Mara felt the tension in her chest slowly ease. But the scars, both physical and emotional, ran deep. She woke up screaming more than once, the nightmares of the Hollow family haunting her sleep, and she knew it would take time to heal. Jonah, too, struggled with the weight of everything that had happened. He spent hours sitting by the window, his gaze distant and his jaw tight, but he never spoke about it. Lila, on the other hand, began to thrive. She made friends with the other children at the shelter, her laughter a stark contrast to the blank expression she had worn for so long. Mara watched her with a mixture of pride and relief, knowing the girl had a chance at a better life. One evening, as the sun set over the town, Mara stood outside the shelter, her arms wrapped around herself. Jonah joined her, his hands in his pockets and his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but sincere, "for giving us a chance." Mara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "We did it together," she said. "And now, we start over." They stood there in silence, the weight of the past slowly lifting, and Mara knew that, no matter what came next, they would face it together. The Haunting of Ravenwood Manor. Chapter 1. The manor's dark past. Ravenwood Manor stood at the edge of a dense, ancient forest, its silhouette cutting through the gray mist like a jagged knife. The mansion was a relic of another era, its blackened stone walls crowned with spires that seemed to pierce the sky. Locals avoided the property, whispering that the manor was cursed, though no one could say exactly why. It was as if the very air around Ravenwood carried a weight, a silent warning to keep away. Those who dared to approach the iron gates swore they felt eyes watching them from the shadows, though no one was ever seen. The Langston family had owned Ravenwood Manor for generations, their wealth and influence stretching back to the early 1800s. They were reclusive, rarely seen in town, and when they were, their presence was unsettling. Julian Langston, the current patriarch, was a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes that seemed to look straight through a person. His wife, Vivian, was elegant but distant, her beauty almost otherworldly. Together, they exuded an air of cold perfection that made townspeople uneasy. The Langstons were not just wealthy, they were untouchable, their secrets buried deep within the walls of Ravenwood. The manor itself was a labyrinth of corridors, secret passages, and rooms that seemed to shift when no one was looking. Fireplaces roared with flames even in the summer, and the chandeliers cast flickering light that danced like restless spirits. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and something darker, something metallic and faintly sweet. Visitors often spoke of feeling a presence in the rooms, as if the walls themselves were alive, watching, waiting. Stories about Ravenwood Manor had been passed down through generations, each more chilling than the last. Servants who worked at the manor would disappear without explanation, their absence hastily covered up by the Langstons. Travelers who sought refuge within its walls were never seen again. Some claimed to hear screams echoing from the forest at night, while others swore they saw strange lights flickering in the upper windows, even when the mansion was believed to be empty. One of the oldest tales involved a young maid who had worked at Ravenwood in the late 1800s. She had been hired to care for the Langston children, but vanished after just a week. Her family came searching for her, only to be turned away by Julian's ancestors, who claimed she had left without notice. Years later, during a renovation, workers found a hidden compartment in the basement wall. Inside was a dress, neatly folded, and a small diary that spoke of unspeakable horrors. The diary ended abruptly, the final pages stained with what appeared to be blood. The Langstons were known for their longevity, a fact that was both admired and feared. Julian and Vivian appeared to be in their 40s, though records showed they had been married for over 6 decades. Their children, Evelyn and Sebastian, were eerily similar in appearance to their parents, as if the family had been sculpted from the same cold, unyielding stone. People whispered that the Langstons had made a pact with something dark, something that granted them unnatural life in exchange for unspeakable deeds. The forest surrounding Ravenwood Manor was as much a part of its legend as the mansion itself. It was a primordial place, its trees twisted and gnarled, their roots clawing at the earth like skeletal fingers. Animals avoided the area, and hunters who ventured too deep often returned empty-handed, their faces pale and shaken. Locals spoke of a figure that roamed the woods at night, a tall, shadowy being with glowing eyes that watched from the darkness. Some believed it was a guardian, others a harbinger of death. The manor's history was a tapestry of blood and betrayal. In the early 1900s, a fire had broken out in the East Wing, claiming the lives of several servants. The Langstons had rebuilt it without explanation, refusing to discuss the incident. Decades later, a wealthy businessman had visited the manor, hoping to strike a deal with Julian. He was found dead in the forest days later, his body drained of blood. The official cause of death was ruled an animal attack, but the townspeople knew better. The Langstons' children, Evelyn and Sebastian, were rarely seen in public. When they were eerily polite, their words carefully measured, their smiles never reaching their eyes. Evelyn, the elder twin, had a quiet intensity, her gaze sharp and calculating. Sebastian, though more outgoing, had a darkness lurking beneath his charm, a sense that he was holding something back. Both seemed older than their years, as if the weight of their family's secrets had aged them prematurely. The manor's library was a vast, dusty room filled with ancient tomes and forbidden knowledge. Its shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with books on alchemy, witchcraft, and the occult. Julian and Vivian were said to spend hours there, poring over texts that spoke of immortality, resurrection, and the binding of souls. Some believed the answers to the Langstons' unnatural longevity could be found within those pages, but no one dared to look. Despite its dark reputation, Ravenwood Manor was undeniably beautiful. Its ballroom, with its polished floors and crystal chandeliers, was a masterpiece of Gothic elegance. Its gardens, though overgrown, were filled with rare flowers that bloomed year-round, their petals unnaturally vibrant. The Langstons hosted occasional parties, inviting the wealthy and influential to dine and dance within the manor's walls. Guests often spoke of the events with a mix of awe and unease, as if they couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the years passed, Ravenwood Manor became more than just a house, it became a symbol of fear. The Langstons were untouchable, their secrets buried too deep to uncover. The manor stood as a reminder of the darkness that could lurk behind wealth and privilege, a monument to the lives that had been lost within its walls. And yet, it continued to draw people in, its allure as powerful as its curse. For those who dared to enter, Ravenwood was not just a place, it was a nightmare waiting to unfold. Chapter 2. The historian's arrival. The rain fell in sheets as Eleanor Hart's car rumbled up the long winding driveway that led to Ravenwood Manor. She had been driving for hours, the dense forest closing in around her like a living thing. The headlights of her car cut through the downpour, illuminating the iron gates that marked the entrance to the estate. They creaked open slowly, as if moved by an unseen hand, and Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. She told herself it was just the cold. The manor loomed ahead, its jagged spires and darkened windows giving it the appearance of a monstrous beast waiting to pounce. Eleanor parked her car and took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. She had read about Ravenwood Manor in dusty old archives and had been instantly captivated by its history. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to document a piece of Gothic architecture that had been shrouded in mystery for centuries. As she approached the massive oak doors, they swung open before she could knock. Standing in the doorway was Julian Langston, his tall, gaunt figure framed by the warm glow of the chandelier behind him. His piercing blue eyes seemed to look straight through her, and for a moment Eleanor felt as though her very soul had been laid bare. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice smooth and measured, "we've been expecting you." Vivian Langston appeared at her husband's side, her beauty almost ethereal in the dim light. She was dressed in a flowing gown of deep crimson, her raven-black hair cascading down her back in perfect waves. "Welcome to Ravenwood Manor," she said, her voice as cold and precise as cut glass. "We're so pleased you could join us." Her smile was polite but did not reach her eyes, and Eleanor felt a pang of unease. The interior of the manor was even more opulent than Eleanor had imagined. The grand foyer was dominated by a sweeping staircase, its marble steps worn smooth by generations of Langstons. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The air was thick with the scent of wood polish and something else, something metallic that made the back of her throat itch. "Let me show you to your room," Vivian said, leading Eleanor up the staircase. The corridors were lined with closed doors, each one identical to the last. The air grew colder as they ascended, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "You'll be staying in the East Wing," Vivian continued, as if sensing her unease. "It's the quietest part of the house." The room was spacious and lavishly decorated, with a four-poster bed and a fireplace that crackled invitingly. A large window overlooked the darkened grounds, the forest stretching out as far as the eye could see. "Dinner will be served at 8, Vivian said, pausing at the door. "Do try to be on time." And with that, she was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in the eerie silence. Eleanor unpacked her things, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She opened her laptop and began typing up her initial observations, the rhythmic clatter of the keys helping to calm her nerves. But as the hours passed, the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, and the flickering of the fire cast strange shapes on the walls. As she explored the room, Eleanor noticed a series of symbols carved into the wooden frame of the bed. They were intricate and unfamiliar, their purpose unclear. She ran her fingers over the carvings, her skin tingling at the contact. There was something deeply unsettling about them, something that made her stomach churn. She made a mental note to research them later, though a part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. At precisely 8 o'clock, Eleanor made her way downstairs to the dining room. The table was set with crystal goblets and silver cutlery, the candlelight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Julian and Vivian were already seated, their expressions unreadable. "Ah, Miss Hart," Julian said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We were just discussing you." The meal was a tense affair, the conversation stilted and formal. Evelyn and Sebastian joined them halfway through, their eyes downcast and their responses monosyllabic. The food was rich and decadent, but Eleanor found she had little appetite. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and when she glanced over her shoulder, she could have sworn she saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. Later that night, as she lay in bed, Eleanor was awakened by the sound of whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she listened more closely, she realized the voices were coming from within the room. She sat up, her heart pounding, and fumbled for the lamp on the bedside table. The room was empty, but the whispers persisted, just on the edge of hearing. They were low and guttural, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. She pulled the covers up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room, and prayed for morning to come quickly. Chapter 3. The first ritual. The whispering voices that had plagued Eleanor's room the previous night lingered in her mind as she moved through the manor the next day. The Langstons seemed unaffected by the eerie atmosphere, going about their daily routines with the same cold precision. Julian spent hours in the library, poring over dusty tomes, while Vivian busied herself with the upkeep of the house. Evelyn and Sebastian were nowhere to be found, their absence both a relief and a source of unease. Eleanor's curiosity about the symbols carved into the bed frame led her to the manor's library. The room was vast, its towering shelves lined with ancient books on subjects ranging from alchemy to the occult. The air smelled of aged parchment and mildew, and the faint sound of rustling pages filled the silence. She found a book on old symbols and began to flip through it, her heart pounding as she recognized some of the markings she'd seen in her room. The symbols, she discovered, were part of a ritualistic language used in dark magic. They were designed to trap and contain spirits, stripping them of their will and binding them to a specific location. The implications were chilling, and Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if the room she was staying in had once been used for something sinister. She slammed the book shut, her hands trembling, and quickly left the library. That evening, Eleanor decided to explore the manor further, hoping to uncover more about its history. The East Wing was particularly fascinating, its rooms filled with antique furniture and strange artifacts. She found a locked door at the end of a long hallway and, after a moment's hesitation, tried the handle. To her surprise, it opened with a soft click, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars filled with strange substances, and the floor was littered with debris. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface stained with what looked like dried blood. Eleanor's heart raced as she approached it, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She was about to turn and leave when she heard the unmistakable sound of chanting. The voices grew louder, echoing through the basement as if carried by some unseen force. Eleanor crouched behind a stack of crates, her breath shallow and rapid. The light from her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She peered around the edge of the crates and saw Julian and Vivian standing before the altar, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames of black candles. Between them lay the body of a young woman, pale and lifeless. The Langstons' voices rose in unison, their words a guttural chant that made Eleanor's skin crawl. Vivian held a dagger in her hand, its blade glinting in the candlelight. She raised it high and brought it down in a swift, deliberate motion, plunging it into the woman's chest. Eleanor stifled a gasp, her stomach churning as the room seemed to pulse with energy. A dark mist rose from the body, swirling and coalescing into a shadowy figure that hovered above the altar. Julian extended a hand toward the mist, his fingers curling as if grasping something unseen. The figure let out an unearthly wail, the sound so piercing that Eleanor had to cover her ears. Slowly, the mist began to dissipate, drawn into a small, ornate box that Julian held in his other hand. The room fell silent, the candles extinguishing as if blown out by an invisible wind. Eleanor's mind raced, struggling to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The Langstons were not just murderers, they were practitioners of dark magic, using their victims' souls to fuel their own immortality. The symbols in her room, the whispers at night, the ghosts of Ravenwood, it all began to make horrifying sense. She knew she had to get out of the manor, but the sound of footsteps approaching the crates froze her in place. "Miss Hart," Julian's voice cut through the silence, cold and measured. "I didn't realize we had an audience." Eleanor's heart pounded as she slowly stood, facing him. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Some secrets are best left buried. Vivian appeared beside him, her crimson gown blending into the shadows. "What shall we do with her?" she asked, her tone disturbingly calm. Julian studied Eleanor for a moment, his gaze piercing. "She's clever," he said finally. "Perhaps too clever. But she may still be of use to us." Eleanor backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, but the staircase felt impossibly far away. Julian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Do not attempt to leave, Miss Hart," he said, his voice low and menacing. "The manor has a way of keeping its secrets and its guests." Eleanor's breath hitched as she realized the truth. She was now a prisoner of Ravenwood, trapped in a nightmare she could never escape. Chapter 4. The children's rebellion. The days following the ritual were a blur of fear and confusion for Eleanor. She stayed in her room as much as possible, avoiding Julian and Vivian, though she could feel their eyes on her every time she ventured into the halls. The manor seemed to close in around her, its walls whispering secrets she could not understand. The symbols on the bed frame seemed to glow faintly in the dark, and the whispers in the room grew louder, more insistent. One night, as Eleanor lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she heard a soft knock at her door. Her heart leapt into her throat, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. "It's us," came the whispered reply. "Evelyn and Sebastian. Please, let us in." Eleanor hesitated, then opened the door to find the twins standing in the hallway, their faces pale and drawn. Evelyn was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk to you," she said, her eyes darting nervously down the corridor. "It's not safe here." Sebastian nodded in agreement, his expression grim. Eleanor stepped aside, letting them into the room, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a dangerous mistake. Once the door was closed, the twins seemed to relax slightly. "We know what you saw in the basement," Evelyn began, her voice steady but urgent. "Our parents, they're not what they seem." Sebastian nodded again, his hands clenched into fists. "They've been doing this for years," he said, "using people's souls to stay alive. We've been forced to help them, but we can't do it anymore." Eleanor stared at them, her mind racing. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes pleading. "Because we need your help," she said. "You're the first person who's come here who might be able to stop them. They've been watching you, testing you. If you try to leave, they'll kill you. But if you stay, you might be able to find a way to break the curse." Sebastian's voice was low and urgent. "There's a way to stop them," he said. "A ritual that can break their hold on the manor and free the souls they've trapped. But it's dangerous, and we can't do it alone. We need your help." Eleanor felt a surge of fear and determination. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "This is a map of the manor," she said, handing it to Eleanor. "There's a hidden room in the west wing where our parents keep their most powerful artifacts. If we can get inside and destroy the box they use to trap souls, it will weaken them enough for the ritual to work." Sebastian nodded. "But we have to be careful," he said. "If they catch us, they'll show no mercy." Eleanor unfolded the map, her eyes scanning the intricate lines and symbols. "When do we do this?" she asked. Evelyn hesitated. "Tomorrow night," she said. "Our parents will be distracted by a guest. They've invited another victim. It's our best chance." Sebastian's expression darkened. "But even if we succeed," he said, "there's no guarantee we'll survive. The manor itself is dangerous, and it's alive. It will fight back." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine but nodded resolutely. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll help you." Evelyn and Sebastian exchanged a look of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly. "We've been waiting for someone like you for a long time." Sebastian placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Be ready," he said. "Tomorrow night, we'll meet you here at midnight." The twins left as quietly as they had come, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She unfolded the map and studied it carefully, memorizing the layout of the manor and the location of the hidden room. The weight of what she had agreed to do settled heavily on her shoulders, but she knew there was no turning back. As the hours passed, the manor seemed to grow more oppressive, its walls closing in around her. The whispers in her room became louder, more insistent, as if the spirits trapped within the manor were trying to warn her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every word the twins had said. Despite her fear, she felt a glimmer of hope, something she hadn't felt since arriving at Ravenwood. When midnight arrived, Eleanor was ready. She dressed in dark clothing and slipped the map into her pocket, her heart pounding in her chest. The twins appeared at her door as promised, their faces set with determination. "Let's go," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. Eleanor nodded, her resolve firm. Together, the three of them crept into the shadows, their footsteps silent as they moved toward the West Wing and the unknown dangers that awaited them. Chapter 5. The Ghosts of Ravenwood. The West Wing of the manor was colder than the rest, the air thick with a damp, musty smell that clung to Eleanor's skin. The dim light from the twins' flashlights danced across the walls, revealing peeling wallpaper and jagged cracks in the plaster. Every creak of the floorboards felt louder in the silence, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Evelyn led the way, her footsteps careful and deliberate, while Sebastian brought up the rear, his eyes darting nervously over his shoulder. Eleanor's hand tightened around the map as they turned down a narrow hallway lined with portraits of the Langston ancestors. The faces in the paintings seemed to follow them, their cold, lifeless eyes filled with a silent judgment. She glanced at Evelyn and Sebastian, who both avoided looking at the portraits, as if the sight of them brought back memories they'd rather forget. "The hidden room is just up ahead," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their breathing. They stopped in front of a large, ornate mirror that hung at the end of the hallway. Evelyn traced her fingers along the edge of the frame, searching for something. "Here," she said finally, pressing a small, hidden button. The mirror swung open with a soft click, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the depths of the manor. Eleanor's heart pounded as she stared into the blackness, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. Sebastian handed her a flashlight, his expression grim. "Stay close," he said, "and whatever you do, don't touch anything. The artifacts in this room are unpredictable." Eleanor nodded, though her hands trembled as she took the flashlight. The three of them descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The walls of the staircase were lined with strange markings, symbols similar to the ones in Eleanor's room, but more intricate, more menacing. At the bottom of the stairs was a heavy wooden door, its surface covered in carvings that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. Evelyn pulled a key from her pocket and inserted it into the lock, her hands steady despite the tension in her posture. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with shelves of artifacts, jars filled with murky liquids, strange, twisted objects, and the ornate box Julian had used in the ritual. The box sat on a pedestal in the center of the room, its surface glowing faintly with a dark, pulsating light. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea as she approached it, the air around it thick with malevolent energy. "This is it," Evelyn said quietly. "The box they use to trap the souls. If we destroy it, their power will weaken." Sebastian nodded, though his face was pale. "But we have to be quick," he said. "They'll know something's wrong as soon as we touch it." Eleanor reached for the box, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, smooth surface. The moment she touched it, the room seemed to shift, the walls closing in around her. The whispers she had heard in her room returned, louder and more desperate, as if the trapped souls were crying out for release. She glanced at Evelyn and Sebastian, who both nodded in encouragement. "Do it," Evelyn said. "Break it." Eleanor lifted the box and brought it down hard against the edge of the pedestal. The impact sent a shockwave through the room. the air crackling with energy. The box split open, releasing a surge of black mist that swirled around them, the whispers turning into screams. The mist coalesced into shadowy figures that floated in the air, their faces twisted in agony and relief. Eleanor stumbled back, her heart racing, as the ghosts of Ravenwood surrounded them. "You freed us," one of the spirits said, its voice a hollow echo. "But the Langstons' hold on this place is still strong. You must finish what you've started." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We will," she said. "We'll end this once and for all." The spirits nodded, their forms beginning to fade as they were pulled into the afterlife. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting slightly. Sebastian placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, his grip firm. "That's only the first step," he said. "They'll be angry, and they'll come after us. We have to be ready." Eleanor nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. She glanced at the box, now shattered into pieces, and felt a small sense of triumph. They had struck a blow against Julian and Vivian, but the fight was far from over. As they left the hidden room, the manor seemed to react to the weakening of the Langstons' power. The walls creaked and groaned, and the air grew colder, as if the house itself was alive and fighting back. Eleanor clutched the map tightly, her mind racing as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors. "What's next?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the manor's protests. Evelyn's expression was grim. "We need to find the source of their power," she said. "The heart of the curse." The three of them moved quickly, their footsteps hurried but silent. The manor seemed to shift around them, the hallways twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Eleanor felt a growing sense of dread, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. The ghosts of Ravenwood had been freed, but the Langstons were still a threat, and they would stop at nothing to protect their dark secrets. Chapter 6. The heart of the curse. The deeper they ventured into the manor, the more Ravenwood seemed to resist them. Hallways stretched endlessly, doors slammed shut on their own, and shadows moved unnaturally in the corners of Eleanor's vision. Evelyn led the way, her face set with determination, while Sebastian kept glancing behind them, his flashlight trembling as he scanned for threats. Eleanor clutched the map tightly, her breath visible in the frigid air, as they approached the heart of the curse. "The source of their power is in the oldest part of the manor," Evelyn explained, her voice low but steady. "The foundation was built over a burial ground, and our ancestors used dark rituals to bind the spirits to the land. That's where Julian and Vivian draw their strength, from the energy of the trapped souls." Eleanor shivered, both from the cold and the implications of Evelyn's words. "How do we stop it?" she asked. Evelyn's eyes darkened. "We have to destroy the binding spell," she said. "But it won't be easy." They reached a heavy, iron-bound door at the end of a narrow corridor. Unlike the other parts of the manor, this door was untouched by time, its surface polished and gleaming, as if it had been cared for meticulously. Evelyn placed her hand on the door, her expression conflicted. "This is it," she said. "The heart of the curse. Beyond this door is something ancient, something dangerous." Sebastian stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "We don't have a choice," he said. "We have to end this." Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, its surface icy to the touch. She pushed the door open, and a wave of cold, damp air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of earth and decay. The room beyond was circular, its walls lined with ancient, crumbling stone. In the center stood a massive, blackened altar, its surface covered in strange, glowing runes. The air hummed with energy, making Eleanor's skin prickle. The room seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the shadows twisted and writhed against the walls. Eleanor stepped inside, her flashlight flickering as it struggled against the oppressive darkness. Evelyn and Sebastian followed, their expressions tense. "This is where it all began," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The first ritual that bound the spirits to this place. If we destroy the altar, the curse will be broken." Sebastian nodded, his voice grim. "But the manor won't let us do it without a fight." Eleanor approached the altar, her heart pounding. The runes on its surface seemed to shift and move, their patterns hypnotic. She placed a hand on the cold stone, and a jolt of energy shot through her, making her gasp. Visions flashed before her eyes, faces of the dead, their voices screaming in unison. She stumbled back, her head spinning, and Evelyn caught her before she could fall. "Are you okay?" Evelyn asked, her voice filled with concern. Eleanor nodded, though her legs felt weak. "We have to hurry," she said. Evelyn pulled a small knife from her pocket, its blade etched with symbols that glowed faintly. "This can disrupt the binding spell," she said. "But we need to act fast." She handed the knife to Eleanor, whose hands were still shaking. "You have to do it," Evelyn said. "You're the outsider. The curse doesn't have as strong a hold on you." Eleanor hesitated, but the determination in Evelyn's eyes gave her strength. She gripped the knife tightly and stepped toward the altar. As she raised the knife, the room seemed to react violently. The shadows surged forward, forming twisted humanoid figures that lunged at them. Evelyn and Sebastian stepped in front of Eleanor, their hands raised defensively. "We'll hold them off," Sebastian shouted. "Just do it." Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before plunging the knife into the center of the altar. The runes flared brightly, and a deafening roar filled the room as the stone began to crack. The shadowy figures screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the altar crumbled. The ground beneath them shook violently, and pieces of the ceiling began to fall. Eleanor stumbled, the knife slipping from her hand as she fought to keep her balance. "We need to get out of here," Evelyn shouted, grabbing Eleanor's arm and pulling her toward the door. Sebastian followed, his face pale as he dodged falling debris. They ran back through the corridor, the manor collapsing around them. The walls seemed to twist and warp, the floor tilting unnaturally beneath their feet. Eleanor's lungs burned as she ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with dust and the sound of crumbling stone, and she could hear the faint, distant wail of the Langstons, their rage echoing through the halls. They reached the grand foyer, where the chandelier swung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals shattering against the floor. The portrait of the Langston ancestors had fallen, the canvas torn and twisted as if the people in the painting were screaming. The front doors were just ahead, but as they approached, Julian and Vivian appeared, their faces twisted with fury. "You think you can destroy what we've built?" Julian snarled, his voice echoing unnaturally. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "It's over," she said. "The curse is broken." Vivian lunged at them, her hands clawed like a wild animal's, but before she could reach them, the floor gave way beneath her, and she fell into the darkness below. Julian screamed, his form dissolving into black mist as the manor collapsed around him. Eleanor, Evelyn, and Sebastian stumbled out into the cold night air, the screams of Ravenwood fading behind them as the manor crumbled into the earth. Chapter 7. The aftermath. The night air was cold and still, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Eleanor, Evelyn, and Sebastian stood at the edge of what had once been the grounds of Ravenwood Manor, now a gaping chasm filled with rubble and dust. The mansion was gone, swallowed by the earth as if it had never existed. Eleanor's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. Evelyn and Sebastian sat beside her, their faces pale and drawn. None of them spoke for a long time, the silence broken only by the distant sound of settling debris. Evelyn finally broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. "It's over," she said. "The curse is broken." Eleanor looked at her, her mind still reeling. "But what about your parents?" she asked. Evelyn's expression darkened. "They're gone," she said. "They've been gone for a long time. What we saw, that wasn't really them. Not anymore." Sebastian leaned back, staring up at the night sky. "We're free," he said, his voice tinged with relief and disbelief. After all these years, we're finally free." Eleanor looked at him, noticing the way his shoulders seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. She felt a pang of sympathy for the twins, who had been trapped in the nightmare of Ravenwood for so long. As the adrenaline began to fade, Eleanor felt the full extent of her exhaustion. Her body ached, and her mind was still trying to catch up with everything that had happened. She looked down at her hands, which were scratched and bruised from the chaos of their escape. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Evelyn sighed. "We start over," she said. "We have a chance to live normal lives now. To leave all of this behind." Eleanor nodded, though the thought of returning to her old life felt impossible. The horrors she had witnessed at Ravenwood had changed her in ways she couldn't yet understand. She glanced at the twins, who seemed to share her uncertainty. "What about you two?" she asked. "Where will you go?" Evelyn and Sebastian exchanged a glance. "We'll figure it out," Evelyn said. "We have each other." The first light of dawn began to peek over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the ruined grounds. Eleanor stood, her legs still shaky, and looked toward the road that led away from Ravenwood. "I need to go," she said. "I need to get away from here." Evelyn nodded, her expression sympathetic. "You should," she said. "You don't belong here." Sebastian stood and extended a hand to Eleanor. "Thank you," he said. "We couldn't have done this without you." Eleanor shook his hand, her heart heavy with the weight of what they had been through. She turned to Evelyn, who hesitated for a moment before pulling her into a tight hug. "Be careful," Evelyn whispered, "and don't look back." Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes as she pulled away. She gave the twins one last glance before turning and walking down the road, leaving Ravenwood and its horrors behind her. The walk back to the main road felt surreal, the world around her eerily quiet. The sun rose higher in the sky, its warmth a comforting contrast to the cold night she had endured. Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but one thing was clear: she had survived. She had faced the darkness and come out the other side. When she finally reached the road, she saw a car approaching in the distance. She waved it down, her heart lifting as it slowed to a stop. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, rolled down the window. "You all right, miss?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, though she knew she must have looked a mess. "Can I get a ride into town?" she asked. The man nodded. "Hop in," he said. As they drove away, Eleanor glanced back at the horizon, where Ravenwood had once stood. The land was empty now, as if the mansion had never existed. She felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, her mind still processing everything that had happened. The man glanced at her. "You look like you've been through a lot," he said gently. Eleanor nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could say that," she replied. The rest of the drive passed in silence, Eleanor staring out the window as the landscape changed from desolate countryside to the familiar streets of the nearby town. The man dropped her off at the bus station, where she could catch a ride back to her own town. "Take care of yourself," he said as she climbed out of the car. "Thank you," she replied, her voice sincere. As she waited for the bus, Eleanor felt a sense of closure settling over her. Ravenwood was gone, and with it, the darkness that had haunted her. She knew the scars of what she had been through would stay with her, but she also knew she was stronger now. She had faced her fears and come out the other side. As the bus pulled up, she took a deep breath and stepped on, ready to leave the past behind and start a new Chapter 8. The shadows that remain life after Ravenwood was supposed to feel like freedom, but for Eleanor, it was anything but. The nightmares began almost immediately, vivid and unrelenting. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the echoes of screams and whispers still ringing in her ears. The faces of the Langstons and the spirits they had trapped haunted her dreams, their hollow eyes staring into hers as if searching for something she couldn't give. She tried to return to her old routines: work, friends, the semblance of a normal life, but everything felt different now. The world seemed muted, as if she were watching it through a filter. Her co-workers noticed the change, commenting on her distant demeanor and the shadows under her eyes. Eleanor brushed off their concerns with a forced smile, but the weight of what she had been through was crushing her. The physical scars from her time at Ravenwood had begun to heal, but the emotional ones ran deeper. She found herself jumping at every creak in her apartment, every flicker of the lights. The symbols etched into the bed frame of her room at Ravenwood seemed to burn in her memory, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow still with her, marking her in ways she didn't fully understand. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, the silence became unbearable. The whispers she had heard in the manor began creeping back, faint at first, but growing louder and more insistent. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out, but they were inside her head, a cacophony of voices she couldn't silence. "You're still one of us," they seemed to say. "You can't escape." Desperate for answers, Eleanor reached out to Evelyn and Sebastian. She had sent them a letter a few weeks after leaving Ravenwood, but they hadn't responded. This time, she decided to call. The phone rang several times before a familiar voice answered. "Eleanor." Evelyn's voice was cautious, almost hesitant. "Yes, it's me," Eleanor replied, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you. Something's wrong." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "We'll meet you," Evelyn said finally. "There's something we need to tell you, too." Eleanor's heart sank at the tone of Evelyn's voice, but she agreed to meet them at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The next day, she drove to the meeting place, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as her mind raced with possibilities. When she arrived, Evelyn and Sebastian were already waiting for her at a corner table. They looked different, their faces drawn and their eyes haunted. Eleanor sat down, her stomach churning with anxiety. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Sebastian before speaking. "It's not over," she said. "The curse, it's still alive. And it's after us." Eleanor felt a cold chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. Sebastian leaned forward, his expression grim. "We thought destroying the altar would end it," he said. "But there's something else, something deeper. The curse was tied to our family, but it's also tied to the land. And now that the manor is gone, it's searching for new hosts." Evelyn nodded. "We've been feeling it too," she said. "The whispers, the nightmares. It's like it's trying to pull us back." Eleanor's mind reeled as she processed their words. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice desperate. Evelyn sighed. "We don't know," she admitted. "But we can't face this alone. We need to figure out how to break the curse for good, before it's too late." Sebastian's eyes were filled with guilt as he looked at Eleanor. "We're sorry," he said. "We didn't want to drag you back into this, but we don't have a choice." Eleanor sat back in her chair, her mind racing. A part of her wanted to run, to leave everything behind and never look back. But she knew that wasn't an option. The curse had marked her, and there was no escaping it. She took a deep breath and nodded. "What's the plan?" she asked. Evelyn's expression softened with relief. "We'll start by researching our family's history," she said. "There has to be something we missed, something that can help us." The three of them spent the rest of the afternoon poring over old books and documents Evelyn and Sebastian had managed to salvage from Ravenwood before its collapse. The pages were filled with dark rituals, strange symbols, and accounts of the Langston ancestors' dealings with the occult. Eleanor felt a growing sense of dread as she read, the weight of the curse pressing down on her. As the sun began to set, they finally found a passage in an old journal written by one of the early Langstons. It spoke of a binding stone, a relic used to anchor the curse to the land. The journal hinted that the stone was hidden somewhere near Ravenwood, protected by powerful wards. Evelyn's eyes lit up with determination. "This is it," she said. "If we destroy the binding stone, the curse will be gone for good." Eleanor nodded. though her heart was heavy. "Then let's do it," she said. Chapter 9. The binding stone. The journey back to the ruins of Ravenwood was heavy with unease. The land was eerily silent, as if holding its breath, and the air felt thick with a lingering malevolence. Evelyn, Sebastian, and Eleanor approached the gaping chasm where the manor had stood, the ground cracked and uneven. The remnants of the mansion were scattered across the area, broken beams and shattered stone lying like bones in a graveyard. Eleanor's chest tightened as she stepped closer, the memories of her escape flooding back. Evelyn carried an old map they had found in the Langston journal, its edges frayed and the ink faded. She studied it intently, her brow furrowed. "According to this, the binding stone is buried deep underground, near the foundation of the house," she said. "We'll need to find the entrance to the vault." Sebastian glanced around, his flashlight scanning the rubble. "It's not going to be easy," he muttered. "This place is a mess." They began their search, sifting through the debris and carefully navigating the unstable ground. The whispers that had been haunting Eleanor grew louder the closer they got to the site of the vault, their voices a chaotic symphony of anger and desperation. She clenched her fists, trying to block them out, but they seemed to seep into her mind, filling her with a sense of dread. Evelyn noticed her discomfort and placed a hand on her arm. "Stay strong," she said. "We're almost there." After what felt like hours, Sebastian stopped at a section of the ruins where the ground seemed to dip unnaturally. He crouched down, brushing away the dirt and debris to reveal a rusted metal hatch. "I think I found it," he said, his voice tinged with both relief and apprehension. Evelyn and Eleanor hurried over, their flashlights illuminating the hatch. The symbol of the Langston family was etched into its surface, the same symbol that had been on the altar in the hidden room. Evelyn and Sebastian worked together to pry the hatch open, the metal groaning in protest. A cold, damp breeze wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it the smell of earth and decay. Eleanor peered down into the abyss, her heart pounding. "Are we really going down there?" she asked, her voice trembling. Evelyn nodded, her expression resolute. "We have to," she said. "This is the only way to end the curse." Sebastian went first, descending the rickety ladder with his flashlight clenched between his teeth. Evelyn followed, and Eleanor took a deep breath before stepping onto the ladder. The descent felt endless, the air growing colder and thicker with each step. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves in a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. They moved forward cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive blackness. The walls of the tunnel were lined with strange carvings, their patterns shifting and writhing in the light. Eleanor felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as if the tunnel itself was alive and watching them. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of rage and despair. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a massive stone door, its surface covered in intricate runes that glowed faintly. Evelyn traced her fingers over the carvings, her expression grim. "This is it," she said. "The entrance to the vault." Sebastian stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "How do we open it?" he asked. Evelyn pulled a small, ornate key from her pocket, the same one she had used to open the hidden room in the manor. "This should do it," she said. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and the door began to rumble open. Beyond it was a vast chamber, its walls lined with shelves of ancient artifacts and jars filled with murky liquids. In the center of the room stood the binding stone, a massive, blackened monolith covered in pulsating runes. The air around it shimmered with dark energy, and Eleanor felt a wave of nausea as she approached it. "We need to destroy it," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "But it won't be easy. The stone is protected by the curse's power." Sebastian pulled a hammer from his bag, his hands trembling slightly. "Let's do this," he said. Eleanor nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. They approached the stone, the whispers growing to a deafening roar. As they raised their tools, the chamber seemed to react violently. Shadows surged from the walls, forming twisted humanoid figures that lunged at them. Evelyn and Sebastian fought back, their movements frantic but determined. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before bringing the hammer down on the stone with all her strength. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber, and the runes flared brightly before beginning to crack. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the stone crumbled. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the walls of the chamber began to collapse. Evelyn grabbed Eleanor's arm and pulled her toward the exit, shouting for Sebastian to follow. They raced back through the tunnel, the vault collapsing around them. As they reached the ladder, the binding stone's final pulse of energy rippled through the earth, and the whispers finally fell silent. Chapter 10. The end of the curse. The trio stumbled out of the tunnel and into the cool night air, their lungs heaving from exertion. Behind them, the ground shuddered violently as the remnants of Ravenwood's foundation collapsed into the earth. Dust and debris filled the air, but the silence that followed was deafening. The whispers that had haunted them for so long were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Eleanor sank to her knees, her hands trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Evelyn and Sebastian stood nearby, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. Evelyn looked back at the ruins, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "It's over," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of fear and torment. Sebastian placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The curse is broken." Eleanor looked up at them, her heart heavy but hopeful. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn turned to her, her expression softening. "Now we live," she said. "We're free from the curse. We can finally move on." Eleanor nodded, though the thought of returning to her old life still felt daunting. The scars of Ravenwood would always be with her, but for the first time, she felt like she could begin to heal. The three of them sat in silence for a while, watching as the dust settled over the ruins. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the desolate landscape. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the cool night air wash over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. The curse was gone, and with it, the darkness that had consumed her. As the night wore on, they began to talk about their lives, their hopes, and their fears. Evelyn and Sebastian shared stories of their childhood at Ravenwood, their voices tinged with sadness but also with a sense of closure. Eleanor listened intently, her heart aching for them. Despite everything they had been through, they had found strength in each other, and she admired their resilience. When the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, they knew it was time to part ways. Evelyn and Sebastian had decided to start fresh in a new town, far away from the memories of Ravenwood. Eleanor, too, felt ready to leave the past behind and begin a new chapter in her life. As they stood to leave, Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver pendant. It was simple but elegant, with a single gemstone at its center. She handed it to Eleanor, her eyes filled with gratitude. "This belonged to my mother," she said. "She would have wanted you to have it. You've become like family to us." Eleanor took the pendant, her throat tightening with emotion. Sebastian stepped forward, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and if you ever need anything, you know where to find us." Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "For everything." Evelyn pulled her into a tight hug, and for a moment, the three of them stood together, united by the bond they had formed in the face of unimaginable darkness. When they finally parted ways, Eleanor watched as Evelyn and Sebastian disappeared down the road, their figures fading into the distance. She held the pendant tightly in her hand, feeling a sense of warmth and connection that she hadn't felt in a long time. Turning toward the horizon, she took a deep breath and began to walk, ready to face whatever the future held. Life after Ravenwood wasn't easy, but it was hers to live. The nightmares faded over time, replaced by dreams of hope and possibility. Eleanor found solace in the small moments, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of laughter, the feeling of being alive. She carried the lessons she had learned at Ravenwood with her, using them to guide her forward. Years later, Eleanor returned to the site of the manor, now overgrown with wildflowers and greenery. The land had been reclaimed by nature, its scars hidden beneath a blanket of life. She knelt down, placing a single white rose on the ground, a tribute to those who had been lost and a symbol of the new beginnings that had arisen from the ashes of the past. As she stood to leave, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of peace. Eleanor smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The curse was gone, but its legacy remained a reminder of the strength and resilience of the human spirit. She turned toward the horizon, ready to embrace the future, knowing that she had faced the darkness and come out the other side.